The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Thom Hartmann Program is also brought to you by Cameron Hughes Wines. Cameron Hughes scours the world looking for the finest wines. You can get more information about Cameron Hughes and his wines at chwine.com/Thom, T-H-O-M. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by XChair, the XChair chair, office chair. XChairTom.com is the website, XChairTHOM.com. Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Superbeats. More information is available over at thomsbeets.com, THOMSBEETS.com, or by calling 800-568-9889. For our book club today, we're reading from Thomas Frank's book, Rendezvous with Oblivion, Reports from a Sinking Society. This is chapter 1, titled Servile Disobedience. Social scientists have tried for more than a century to understand how class works. Psychological experiments on the subject, however, are a relatively novel thing, so I was surprised to discover a few years ago that psychologists had published a series of papers on the behavioral aspects of social status, and that their findings were almost uniformly unflattering towards society's winners. In one 2009 study in Psychological Science found that in conversations with strangers, high-status people tend to do more doodling and fidgeting, and also to use fewer engagement cues, looking at the other person, laughing, nodding their heads. A 2010 paper published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that lower-class individuals, in quote, turned out to be better performers on measures of such pro-social virtues as generosity, charity, and helpfulness. A third study found that those of higher status were noticeably worse at assessing the emotions of others or figuring out what facial expressions mean. All of which is to say the rich are different from you and me. They are more rude and less generous. They don't understand, they don't get what others are thinking, and apparently they don't really care. Perhaps this is obvious to you. After all, people don't design toxic debt obligations by calling out what they learned in Sunday school. Still, the research aroused media interest. The Christian Science Monitor's 2010 account of one study ended with this quotation from Michael Krauss, then the University of California, San Francisco, who was one of the researchers, quote, "Being empathic is one of the first steps to helping other people. One of the first things we're really interested in is what can make wealthy people, affluent people, the people with the capacity to give, what can make them empathic? I think I see the urgency of Dr. Krause's question. After all, we have spent the past several decades doing everything we could to transfer the wealth of the nation into the bank accounts of the affluent to send them victorious, happy, and glorious long to reign after us, over us. Oh, we've cut their taxes, gladly transferring much of the cost of keeping their property safe onto our own shoulders. We've furnished them with special megaphones so that their voices can be heard over the hubbub of the crowd. We've conferred upon them separate and better schools, their very own transportation system, and a full complement of private security guards. We've built an entire culture of courtiers and sycophants to make their every working hour an otherworldly delight. We let them construct a system of bonuses and executive compensation on the theory that it would be good for everyone if the people at the top got to take home much, much more than the rest of us. And when it turned out that the theory was wrong, that in the most famous cases, executives chased bonuses not to the shareholders' benefit, but at their expense, why, we promptly bailed them out. We allowed them to step into the Fed's discount window and fill their pockets. We generously transferred their reckless investments to our balance sheet, and we chastised them with little more than a polite request that they please not do it again. We've done everything we can to lift them up and exalt them as the new Leviathan. The least they can do in return, one feels, is to show a little empathy. Besides, look what we've done with the old Leviathan, the government. For decades, we've attacked it, redirected it, outsourced it, and filled it with incompetence and cronies. Yes, it still works well enough when we need to blow up some small country, but those branches of it designed to help our Americans of lower socioeconomic status, in quotes, as the scientists would put it, are now bare. We need the rich to be nice. We need them to stop doodling, paying and to pay attention and get generous. Now that the government has divested from the empathy business, we need the rich to discover brotherly love and fast. Come to think of it, wasn't that supposed to be the deal in the first place? The arrangement Andrew Carnegie brokered over a century ago when he made his big career move from Steel King to public library baron? The laissez-faire social contract would grant private business a free hand, but in exchange, those who piled up massive wealth were supposed to extend a magnanimous hand to the rest of us. As Carnegie wrote in his famous 1889 essay, The Gospel of Wealth, we don't need socialism to solve our problems. Philanthropy is the true antidote for the temporary inequality distribution of wealth and reconciliation of the rich and poor, quoting Carnegie. Going further, Carnegie argued that the duty of the man of wealth was, quote, to consider all surplus revenues which come to him simply as trust funds, which he's called upon to administer in the manner which, in his judgment, is best calculated to produce the most beneficial results for the community. The man of wealth thus becoming the mere trustee and agent for his poorer brethren, end quote. That same way of thinking led Carnegie to support the estate tax. Of all forms of taxation, this seems the wisest, he wrote. It was wise because it would, quote, induce the rich man to attend to the administration of wealth during his life. And if he didn't, then the tax would return most of his hoardings to the community from which it came, using Carnegie's words. Vestiges of the Carnegie attitude survive to this day. 2009 study of high net worth individuals by Barclays Wealth confirmed that American philanthropists tend to understand their giving in a context in which the state is either absent or irrelevant. And of course, there are plenty of nice plutocrats who don't fidget or doodle when talking to strangers and who have no problem endowing a ward or a wing in return for a commemorative plaque. The business headlines even occasionally tell of billionaires coming together under the leadership of Warren Buffett and Bill Gates to donate their fortunes to worthy causes. But the billionaires with the strongest sense of class solidarity have a very different plan for their disposable income, activating their lobbyists in Washington, building grassroots movements to march on their behalf, and using their media properties to run experiments on human credulity. Rendezvous with Oblivion.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Greetings, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth, and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. Thom Hartmann here with you. It's the day after the 4th of July. And I'm looking, with this whole Supreme Court case thing, or the Supreme Court, rather, this opening as a result of Justice Anthony Kennedy retiring, I guess would be the word. I'm concerned that this could be the beginning of a new, what's referred to as the Lochner era, and I'll tell you what that means. and that in turn could lead to essentially a new civil war in the United States, or a breaking up of the United States. Let me explain. The Lochner era ran from the late 1890s until 1937. And it was a Supreme Court that struck down child labor laws, said, hey, no problem, it's fine for 10-year-olds to work in factories. It was the Supreme Court that struck down minimum wage laws, said, requiring minimum wage was an inappropriate intrusion of government into the right of a business and their employees to privately contract with each other. These, by the way, are positions that are still held by libertarians like, for example, Charles Koch, or presumably Robert Mercer and others. They struck down regulations of the banking industry, saying the government has no business regulating banking. Which, by the way, in many ways, because keep in mind, this court started in 1897, doing all this. It became this, there was finally a fifth justice put on there, a tie-breaking justice that just flipped the court to the right. They struck down the law, so that led right to the great crash of 1929, striking down the banking laws. They struck down laws regulating the insurance industry, said, again, government has no business interfering in the so-called free market, in the private marketplace. They struck down laws regulating the transportation industry. And they kept doing this. This was like, a 40-year period from 1897 to 1937. And they invalidated labor laws, protections for unions. They said that's not the government's business. This was an extremely libertarian, or what today we would call, conservative Republican, Koch-funded, Freedom Caucus court. So just kind of put that in your biocomputer and consider this. And by the way, our number is 202-808-9925 if you would like to weigh in on how you think this is going to play out. If we end up with a new Lochner court, if Donald Trump puts, and it's increasingly looking like every single one of the nominees that he's evaluating, every single one of them is one of these just extreme right-wing ideologues. There's a piece in today's Washington Post about Amy Coney Barrett, who almost certainly will strike down aggressively, would strike down Roe v. Wade. But it goes way beyond Roe v. Wade. I mean, this is, and she also called for a more, in 2003, in an article she wrote, she called for a more flexible understanding of stare decisis, in other words, established law. So whether it is the law establishing Social Security that the Lochner era court originally thought was socialism, they didn't strike it down, but they were inclined. They damn near did. I mean, this is why in 1936, during the election of '36, Franklin Roosevelt said, "I'm going to pack the court. Screw this stuff. We're gonna add more justices to the court, and I'm going to appoint them because this court is fighting everything we're doing with the New Deal." Well, now we may have a court that actually wants to take down the New Deal, not just the Great Society, but the New Deal itself. So if one of Trump's nominees gets on the court, or when, because it's pretty much a certainty it's going to happen eventually, and if they are one of these Federalist Society, again, a right-wing organization that grew out of the Powell memo, funded by the right wing, the petro billionaires. If one of these nominees, 100% of them coming through the Federalist Society, is put on the bench, and we end up back in the Lochner era, we end up with a Supreme Court that strikes down Social Security, that strikes down Medicare, that strikes down Medicaid, that strikes down all forms of welfare programs, as the Lochner court did. That strikes down our child labor laws, that strikes down our minimum wage laws, that strikes down all vestiges of an employee's right to unionize, that basically turns America over to the corporate institutions. If that happens, on the one hand, at the same time that the vast majority of Americans don't want this, and this is a really important point, at the same time that the vast majority of Americans don't want this, what happens? I mean, look at these study. Pew, just did a new survey, the Pew Research Center, which is not a liberal institution. This is not some left-wing think tank. This is just right down the middle, endowed by a wealthy family to provide facts to the public. And what they found is that overall 67% of Americans now believe that our government is run by special interests, period. I'm among them. I wouldn't say period, but largely. But here's where it gets interesting. If you look at Citizens United, which, by the way, the decision was written by Anthony Kennedy, who's retiring. If you look at Citizens United, 70% of Democrats, 67% of Republicans think that the court should overturn Citizens United. In other words, more than 2/3, nearly 3/4 of Americans believe that Citizens United should be undone, that money is a corrupting influence in politics. And if we go back to a Lochner-type court, if Trump appoints one of these Federalist Society judges and the Democrats are not capable of blocking it, or a couple of them even collaborate, and inevitably that's going to happen. He's got another 2.5 years. If that happens, and say 20 states, because the way that this will be done, when the court struck down the child labor laws, for example, basically what happened was some states said we're going to have child labor laws, and other states said we're not, which is how the court wanted it. In other words, it's the whole 10th Amendment thing, states' rights. Leave it up to the states. Now, states can't functionally administer Social Security programs, or perhaps a large state. New York and California probably could, maybe Florida, maybe Texas, but pretty much every other state in the union, maybe Illinois, but pretty much every other state in the union would not be able to administer a single-payer health care system like Medicare is and Medicaid is, because they just don't have the critical mass. Vermont tried it. They actually passed the law, got a governor elected based on the promise that he would put the law into effect, and then they discovered with only 600,000 people in the state, that's not a large enough mass to have a single-payer health care system. So if this court strikes down Medicare at the federal level and states try to do it, you're going to end up with, a half a dozen or a dozen states that actually can do it. And the same with Social Security. It's a single-payer pension program. If this gets struck down at the federal level, a law, and of course, obviously, Roe v. Wade, abortion, and child labor laws, and the right to unionize, if these get struck down, there's going to be, 20, 25 states that basically go back to the way the law was in the 1890s. Workers will have no rights, women will have no rights, minorities will have very few rights. The court has already begun this process, gutting under John Roberts, back a couple of years ago, gutting the Voting Rights Act. Are we going to end up basically two countries where the blue states have a high quality of life and high standard of living and health care for all, and they get more and more like Canada, and the red states say, hey, whatever the billionaires want, we'll just, people should just trust to charity. If you want your health pay, your hospital bill paid, go to the local church and ask. That's what charity's for. That's what churches are for. And abortion is illegal, and women are being put in prison, and doctors are being run out of town. Could we end up as two nations, or have we already to a certain area, to a certain extent? But the larger question is, could this happen in a way that could essentially be a second civil war, not necessarily a shooting war, but just this radical bifurcation, this radical separation of East and West Coast America from the middle of the United States. Now, the upper Midwest, used to be part of the East and West Coast. In other words, used to be affluent, because they had all these great manufacturing jobs. Those are by and large gone. So, that's poor too.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So what happens? How does this play out? What do you see happening? I'll tell you what I see happening after the break, and then we'll pick up your phone calls and we'll talk about this. And welcome back. This is not, my dad's Republican Party. I just have to say. Okay, let's see here. Bobby in Los Angeles. Hey, Bobby, thanks for watching Free Speech TV. What's on your mind?
Hello, I should call you Dr. Hartmann, by the way. Thanks for taking my call. I was just wondering, in the 24-hour news cycle, how none of these cable news networks are able to show the protests that are going on in other countries. For example, in Iran, there's mass protests going on. I actually support the stance of, this administration of actually voicing an opinion. But I just wanted to, get your take on why nobody really shows, any good, real actual reporting anymore.
Oh, and there was, the kids from Parkland are doing a bus tour all over the United States. It's getting absolutely no coverage. It's being completely ignored. You've got protests. I mean, here in Portland, they shut down the ICE building, for almost a week. You've got protests all over the country. Outside of some coverage on over the weekend on MSNBC, to the best of my knowledge, none of these things are being covered by the large corporate press, by the large corporate media. And the reason is really simple, Bobby. It's because it's not profitable. They would have to send reporters out into the field. They would have to pull the packages together. There's costs associated with getting people into those places. And, they're looking for stuff that they can cover that is cheap, that's easy, where they can use stock footage or other people's footage. And the old saying, when it bleeds, it leads. The stuff that is, the rage against the Republicans and the rage of the Republicans. This is the media narrative of our day, right? Is this, and sadly, they'll pick 3 or 4 or 5 stories that they can afford to cover because they've got to keep costs down so that the stockholders and the CEOs of these big media companies can make a good living, and just narrowly focus on those stories. And so you don't get it. For example, on the Supreme Court, they're all they talk about is abortion. I'm pointing out there's a hell of a lot more than abortion at stake here, and the rest of the media is just completely ignoring this stuff. So I think it's largely. Go ahead.
It's so sad. Sorry, sir. It's 24 hours. How can you have 24 hours breaking news on the same recycled story? It's just absurd.
I know. I agree. Well, the business assumption and the business model, and I, being in this business, I know that there's actually some truth to this, is that audiences turn over really rapidly. And so most people who watch a network like CNN or MSNBC, Fox actually has much longer, what's called TSL, time spent listening. I'm not sure what the TV version of that is, but the stickiness of their programming. People will watch Fox for hours. People typically watch CNN or MSNBC for an hour or less. And in radio, it's typically 15 minutes. People just tune in when they're getting their car, and when they get to where they're going, they turn the radio off. And so, knowing this, the media knows that they can just take a few stories and recycle them over and over again, and they reach this larger audience in a very inexpensive fashion. So I would say it's being driven by a desire for profits and an understanding that there is that churn in the marketplace. Bobby, great question. Thanks a lot for the call. We'll be back. It's 21 minutes past the hour. What do you think is going to happen? Are we facing a new civil war here without the guns? So here's what I think is going to happen, and the big question in my mind is how far will it go, and will it provoke a response, and will that response be, like the French Revolution, or will that response be something very, very muted? And I'm certainly not calling for a French Revolution response, but there are people out there who are, mostly on the right, oddly enough, or not oddly enough, predictably enough. But what I think is going to happen is an extension of what is already happening, right? When the Supreme Court, rolled back voting rights, you had about 30 states immediately jump in to suppress your right to vote, to make it harder and harder and harder to vote. And some of them have been insanely successful at this, literally removing millions of people from their voting rolls over the last decade or so. When the Supreme Court rolled back protections for unionization. You saw a massive union busting on a state-by-state basis. This goes all the way back to Taft-Hartley in 1947. When the Supreme Court drilled a hole in Obamacare and said a state doesn't have to expand Medicaid so that everybody in the state has health insurance regardless of their income, but only rich people now, or people who are, have really good jobs, are going to end up with health insurance. What you had was a bunch of states who said, okay, cool, we'll do that. We'll go along with that. We'll let people just die in the streets. I mean, you had other states that said, no, we're going to intervene. We're going to re-regulate the markets ourselves. California was at the lead of that. So I think that what will happen is this splitting apart of America. You've got, in some red states right now, Louisiana, Mississippi, you have infant mortality rates and maternal mortality rates that are literally third world rates of death of children, newborn children and mothers in pregnancy. 3 times what the death rate is in Canada, for example, or what the death rate is in California. So we have these states already that have become basically these massive pockets of poverty because of their governor's policy. I mean, Matt Bevins, he's Tennessee or Kentucky. I always mix those two states up. But Matt Bevins, the newly, I'm pretty sure it's Tennessee, but whichever, one of those two states. This guy was just, elected governor. He replaced a Democrat. He's the new Republican governor. And he just made a major cut to Medicaid. It's Kentucky. Thank you, Sean. And so in Kentucky, he's literally knocking 1 million people, or 600,000, I think was the number, off the health care rolls in that state, because the Supreme Court said he could do it. And he's a Republican. So when we get a Federalist Society on the court, and that's pretty much a certainty eventually, and the court becomes like the Lochner Court was from 1897 until 1937, when Franklin Roosevelt scared the bejesus out of him and said, I'm going to pack the court, and actually started the process of doing it. The president and Congress have the ability to do that. And the court said, okay, we're going to change our mind. We're going to go along with you. I mean, that's literally what happened, right? But I don't see somebody in the White House right now who's going to say to the court, oh, you can't do away with child labor laws. You can't do away with the right to unionize. Keep in mind, this, as I said earlier, this is not my father's Republican Party. The Republican Party platform of 1956, this is the Dwight Eisenhower's Republican Party. I am reading from their party platform. The record of performance of the Republican administration on behalf of our working men and women goes still further. The federal minimum wage has been raised for more than 2 million workers. Social Security has been extended to an additional 10 million workers, and the benefits of Social Security have been raised for 6.5 million people. The protection of unemployment insurance has been brought to 4 million additional workers. Increased workmen's compensation benefits for longshoremen and harbor workers. Increased retirement benefits. Increased wage increases. Improved welfare and pension plans for federal employees, which, by the way, the Supreme Court just struck down. The laws which protect the working standards of our people. It opens, the Republican Party platform of 56 opens with this quote from Dwight Eisenhower. Quote, in all those things which deal with people, be liberal, be human. That's how it opens. But then in 1980, when David Koch ran for vice president of the Libertarian Party ticket, And I think it's safe to assume his brother Charles, who now basically runs their political operation, shares his perspective. These are the actual quotes from the platform on which David Koch ran for vice president. We urge the repeal of federal campaign finance laws. We favor the abolition of Medicaid and Medicare. We favor the repeal of the fraudulent, virtually bankrupt, and increasingly oppressive Social Security system. We propose the abolition of the government post office. We support the repeal of all minimum wage laws. We advocate the complete separation of education and state. Government ownership, operation, regulation, and subsidies of schools and colleges should be ended. We support the abolition of the Environmental Protection Agency. We support the abolition of the Food and Drug Administration. We support the end of all welfare programs and tax-supported services for children. We oppose all government welfare relief projects.
Listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We oppose aid to the poor programs. We want a repeal of the Occupational Safety and Health Act and all consumer product safety laws. Really? Oh. And this book was published, I believe, in the late 90s, just FYI. 1998. America feels like it's unraveling. Though we live in an era of relative peace and comfort, we have settled into a mood of pessimism about the long-term future, fearful that our superpower nation is somehow rotting from within. Neither an epic victory nor over communism nor an extended upswing of the business cycle can buoy our public spirit. The Cold War and the New Deal struggles are plainly over, but we are of no mind to bask in their successes. The America of today feels worse in its fundamentals than the one many of us remember from our youth, a society presided over by those of supposedly lesser consciousness. Wherever we look, from L.A. to D.C., from Oklahoma City to Sun City, we see paths to a foreboding future. We yearn for civic character, but satisfy ourselves with symbolic gestures and celebrity circuses. We perceive no greatness in our leaders, a new meanness in ourselves. Small wonder that each new election brings a new jolt, its aftermath, a new disappointment. I'd add this was at the height of the Newt Gingrich and impeachment and all that kind of craziness. Not long ago, America, which is the predecessor, has really set up Donald Trump. Not long ago, America was more than the sum of its parts. Now it is less. Around World War II, we were proud as a people, but modest as individuals. Fewer than 2 people in 10 said yes when asked, "Are you a very important person?" Today, more than 6 in 10 say yes. Where we once thought ourselves collectively strong, we now regard ourselves as individually entitled. Yet even while we exalt our own personal growth, we realize that millions of self-actualized persons don't add up to an actualized society. Popular trust in virtually every American institution, from business and governments to churches and newspapers, keeps falling to new lows. Public debts soar, the middle class shrinks, welfare dependencies deepen, and cultural arguments worsen by the year. We now have the highest incarceration rate and the lowest eligible voter participation rate of any major democracy in the world. Statistics inform us that many adverse trends, crime, divorce, abortion, scholastic aptitudes, may have bottomed out, but we're not reassured. Optimism still attaches to self, but no longer to family or community. This is the consequence of Reaganism. Most Americans express more hope for their own prospects than for their children's or the nation's. Parents widely fear that the American dream, which was there solidly for their parents and still there barely for them, will not be there for their kids. Young householders are reaching their mid-30s, never having known a time when America seemed to be on the right track. Middle-aged people look at their thin savings accounts and slim-to-none pensions, scoff at an illusory Social Security trust fund, and try not to dwell on what a burden their old age could become. Seniors separate into their own leisure world, recoiling at the lost virtue of youth while trying not to think about the future. We perceive our civic challenge as some vast, insoluble Rubik's Cube. Behind each problem lies another problem that must be solved first, and behind that lies another and another ad infinitum. To fix crime, we have to fix the family, but before we do that, we have to fix welfare, and that means fixing our budget, and that means fixing our civic spirit, but we can't do that without fixing moral standards, and that means fixing our schools and churches, and that means fixing the inner cities, and that's impossible unless we fix crime. There's no fulcrum upon which to rest a policy lever. People of all ages sense that something huge will have to sweep across America before the gloom can be lifted. But that's an awareness we suppress, as a nation, we're in deep denial. While we grope for answers, we wonder if analysis may be crowding out our intuition. The reward of the historian is to locate patterns that recur over time and to discover the natural rhythms of social experience. In fact, at the core of modern history lies this remarkable pattern. Over the past 5 centuries, Anglo-American society has entered a new era, a new turning, every 2 decades or so. At the start of each turning, people change how they feel about themselves, the culture, the nation, and the future. Turnings come in cycles of 4. Each cycle spans the length of a long human life, roughly 80 to 100 years, a unit of time the ancients called seculum. Together, the 4 turnings of the seculum comprise history's seasonal rhythm of growth, maturation, entropy, and destruction. The first turning is a high, an upbeat era of strengthening institutions and weakening individualism, where a new civic order implants and the old values regime decays. The second turning is an awakening, a passionate era of spiritual upheaval when the civic order comes under attack from a new values regime. The third turning is an unraveling, a downcast era of strengthening individualism and weakening institutions when the old civic order decays and the new values regime implants. And the fourth turning is a crisis, a decisive era of secular upheaval when the values regime propels the replacement of the old civic order with a new one. Each turning comes with its own identifiable mood. Always these mood shifts catch people by surprise. In the current seculum, the first turning was the American high of the Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy presidencies. As World War II wound down, no one predicted that America would soon become so confident and institutionally muscular, yet so conformist and spiritually complacent. But that's what's happened. The second turning was the consciousness revolution, stretching from the campus revolts of the mid-60s to the tax revolts of the early 80s. Before John Kennedy was assassinated, no one predicted that America was about to enter an era of personal liberation and cross a cultural divide that would separate anything thought or said after from anything thought or said before. But that's what happened. The third turning has been the culture wars, an era that began with Reagan's mid-1980s Morning in America and is due to expire around the middle of the decade, 8 or 10 years from now. Amid the glitz of the early Reagan years, no one predicted that the nation was entering an era of national drift. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Boy, this is amazing. Credo Action. I just got one of their things. 60% of Trump's incarcerated immigrants are held in private prisons built by companies like CoreCivic and Geo Group. And apparently there's an enormous amount of funding for these organizations by Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, and BlackRock. They all hold stock in these companies. And the big banks also keep Geo Group and CoreCivic in business with lucrative loans. And you can see the whole thing over at credoaction.org. Fascinating stuff. But, again, if the Supreme Court goes total right wing, there will be no checks on this, right? No checks on it. So your thoughts. Rick in Irwin, Tennessee. Hey, Rick, thanks for calling. What's up?
Hi, how you doing, Tom?
Good. What's on your mind? What do you think about this?
I've been sitting here drinking beer and smoking a cigar and reading the Constitution, and I read Article 3, and it seems to me if Franklin Roosevelt tried to pack the court, what we ought to do is we ought to get a Democratic president and a Congress and a Senate and shrink the court. Instead of trying to put more on it, knock it down to 7, and we can get these 2 idiots that Trump is going to appoint off, or if he appoints 4, knock it down to 5.
Yeah, actually, you're right, and as radical as it sounds what you're proposing, Rick, as radical as that may sound, the Supreme Court, the size of the Supreme Court, the number of people on the Supreme Court has been adjusted, I think, 7 times in our history. And it's gone from 7 to 9 to 11 to 9, as I recall. But in any case, it's been adjusted a number of times. And Congress has that explicit power. It's Article 3, Section 2, Paragraph 2, to regulate the court. And one of those regulations is establishing the size of the court. So, it's not inconceivable that a Democratic president, House, and Senate, although it would take probably a supermajority, 60 senators, which we may have after 2020, who knows, that could... if the Supreme Court went totally nuts, like they did during the Lochner era, could simply pass a law saying that the Supreme Court shall have 7 justices, not 9, And the two most recently appointed justices become justices emeritus. In other words, they're retired. And you could let them hang around and offer their opinions or something, but they lose their vote. Certainly, Congress could do that. But that doesn't address what happens to the United States. I mean, what might happen to our nation? Bob in Ashburn, Virginia, you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, hi, Tom. What you were speaking about put me in mind of a really interesting talk by the late Gore Vidal that he gave to the National Press Club in 1994, and it's actually available on YouTube. Gore predicted, Gore could be very prescient, and he predicted that occurrences within the first several decades of the coming century, which was now, would lead eventually to the devolution of the country. That it would, as he described it, would be split into smaller, more workable units that would be essentially autonomous. And Washington would become, for all intents and purposes, a ceremonial center.
Yeah. Well, and that's the direction we're moving. I mean, that's what David Koch campaigned on. That is the libertarian vision for America. Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that. Well, I don't think that's what Gore was proposing, though.
No, it's what he was. That was his nightmare scenario. Absolutely. Gore Vidal was a good guy. I'm very familiar with him. In fact, in his autobiography, his last autobiography, Point to Point Navigation, the last two chapters both cite writings by this guy Thom Hartmann. So I've paid a lot of attention to Gore Vidal as a result of that.
Okay.
But and he, in a favorable way. I mean, he spoke very well of me and of the writing that I had done. And I think you're right. And I think that's already happening. This is my point. I mean, Mississippi is basically, and any state with a Republican governor is increasingly being run like a third world country. And the quality of life of people in those states is increasingly like a third world country. Excellent point, Bob. Thanks a lot for the call, and thanks for making it. Brian in North Branch, Minnesota. Brian, what's on your mind?
Hey, good morning, Tom. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
It seems that many of these wars are prefaced by some violent incident. We had the Boston Massacre before the American Revolution, Bleeding Kansas, John Brown's raid before the Civil War. I think Charlottesville could be a precursor to a civil war, and I do think that a Lochner-era type judge appointment will lead to a shooting war with drone strikes, cyber attacks, tanks, the works.
Wow. See, I think that there's already the beginnings of a cyber civil war going on in the United States right now, and from doxing to online harassment to outright hacking. But boy, a shooting war. I hope it would never come to something like that. But I think your point of Charlottesville, if there are a lot more Charlottesvilles that happen, and by the way, they are happening on a fairly regular basis. They're just not largely being covered by the media. But the right-wing media is covering them and amplifying them and celebrating them. And if one of those things turns violent, or if somebody gets killed, or a number of people get killed or seriously hurt, it could be a real mess. Yeah, excellent point, Brian. Thanks for calling and making it. Rich in Calumet, Michigan. Hey, Rich, what's up?
First off, I want to apologize. Last time I called, I kind of got on a depressing run about how horrible things are, not only for me, but a lot of people. But basically...
but they are horrible for a lot of people.
I kind of agree with your last caller there. I really see... It's something to do with the human condition. We seem to repeat the same mistakes over and over again.
Yeah.
And when they block history so people can't go back and reflect on the problems that we have to evolve, to become better, we're doomed basically to make the same mistakes.
Yeah. And kids, in our schools today, they do not learn about the Lochner Court. They do not learn about the labor fights in the 1930s. I'm sorry?
I said civics and everything are gone.
Yeah.
My daughter, she's in the middle of going into high school, and so many things that I learned in school, they just don't teach.
That's right. Yeah.
And it's mind-boggling.
Yeah, and
lack of a better word, but I really see, the whole thing with the Pinkertons, actually Free Speech had a really good program on a plutocracy. It was like a mini series, and I urge people to watch it because it really opens up the mind of what's gone on and how we may be able to prevent some of these things to happen.
Yeah. Well, that's going to be one of the keys, but the Supreme Court could be the catalyst to all of this. Rich, excellent points all. Thanks for the call. Alan in Phoenix, Arizona. Hey, Alan.
Hey, Dr. Hartman.
It's Tom, and my doctorate is honorary, so it's not necessary. What's up?
Well, what I wanted to say was we think me and my buddies, we already think that there's already two Americas, from the disparity of the criminal justice system, how that's been distributed. Just the terminology, white supremacy and minority, there's a division at that point. So at this point, I really think there's already two Americas. I really do, I think.
Well, this is, John Edwards.
Thoughts are.
Yeah, John Edwards campaigned on this in 2004, for vice president along with John Kerry. And, the two Americas. And he was very clear. There are two Americas, and there's two major bifurcations. As you're pointing out, Alan, there's Black America and white America, and Black America has, the average African-American family in the United States has a net worth of around $5,000. The average white family in the United States has a net worth of around $80,000, or at least that was the case during the 2004 election. I haven't updated my numbers since then, but that, John Edwards just pounded those numbers. And then also, you've got, the poorer states, in quotes, which tend to have large black populations, but not always. You've got these poorer states, the ones that are run by these laissez-faire Republicans, where you've got high poverty rates, high unemployment rates, high sickness rates, high bankruptcy rates from medical expenses. So yeah, spot on. Very, very well said. Nick in Birmingham, Alabama. Nick, your thoughts?
Hi, Tom. It's my first time calling in.
Thank you.
My thought is that with the upcoming fight over the Supreme Court pick, we know Trump's going to nominate someone, as far to the right as possible.
Yep.
And I think the Democrats' only option is to revoke something called unanimous consent. Now, for anything to happen in the Senate, practically anything, even I think for them to close business at the end of the day, they need consent of all 100 senators. And 99% of the time, that's always given. But all it takes is one member to object. That can be anyone. It can be Chuck Schumer. It can be Claire McCaskill. It could be anybody. All they have to do is say, I ask unanimous consent on XYZ motion, and all it takes is one to say, I object, and it's got to go to a member vote. They could bog down the Senate. It could take them all day.
But then it goes to a member vote, and all it requires is a simple majority. You can't filibuster unanimous consent.
Right, but it'll just slow them down, is what I'm saying. If for every single procedure it requires a member vote, it could take them all day to pass a single measure.
Well, didn't the Republicans do that with some frequency during the Obama presidency?
Not on everything.
Uh-huh.
Sure. If it was something that they weren't, all about. If it was.
So basically, what you're talking about here is a strategy, Nick, and I know there's other people talking about strategies to basically block a Supreme Court nominee. Because now we're going to have a 4-4 court, which is, when we had a 4-4 court during that year, actually turned out okay. Not terrible,
right.
But not wonderful, but okay. That if we can maintain a 4-4 court until after the 2020 election by Democrats, gumming up the works in the case that you're talking about, or there's a major campaign going in the media right now to encourage Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski to simply quit caucusing with the Republicans and become Democrats. And if they were to become Democrats, the Democratic Party would embrace them and all kinds of wonderful stuff would happen. That seems to me like probably the most viable way to really gum up the works is to flip one or both of those two women and
right.
to use the court and the virtual certainty that the Federalist Society, particularly if he appoints Amy, what's her name, this woman who is openly anti-abortion. And has been throughout her career and has written legal papers on it and made legal decisions on it. And she's just a brand new federal judge. She was just put on the bench in November by Trump.
Well, they only want her for the optics, so that when the 5-4 opinion banning abortion comes down, they can say, "Oh, it was written by a woman. This is an anti-woman measure."
Exactly. No, I get it. And Trump has this choice. I mean, the two most prominent members are Amy, who is anti-abortion, and Kavanaugh, the man, I'm forgetting his first name, who has over and over repeatedly written and spoken about how a sitting president, cannot be indicted and cannot even be subpoenaed. He can just say, I don't have to talk to you guys. You have, the courts have no authority over me. I'm the king. And so Trump is trying to decide which of these two to put on. Does he satisfy the religious right, or does he protect his own butt? And if Kavanaugh is also anti-abortion, he gets a twofer, and then another white man goes on the court. So we'll see how this plays out. But gumming up the works. I mean, there are some strategies. Thank you for that point, Nick. Gumming up the works is a strategy. Whether it's a strategy that can last 2.5 years, I'm very skeptical. Flipping Murkowski and Collins, that would be a major coup. That would save the republic. But I'm very skeptical that that'll happen. And so if this goes forward and we end up with a Lochner kind of court, what happens to our country?
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archive.
Could there, for example, be a mass exodus from red states into blue states? And could the blue states start saying, hey, we're going to build a wall? We'll be back. And welcome back. Leslie, watching Free Speech TV in Central Square, New York. Hey, Leslie, what's up?
Hey, Tom, how you doing?
Good.
Hey, I most certainly agree with you about the idea of them packing the court and what it can do to this country. It's unthinkable. But I'm going to get back to this thing because I figure it still needs to be hammered. And I think it's changing slowly, but I don't know if it's going to be fast enough to save America, with the Democratic Party, with the progressives slowly changing it. The ones that are still in power are still doing the show. Just like this morning, I heard that there's going to be a bunch of Democrats that's going to vote for the so-called nominee and all that junk. I'll tell you, if it wasn't for the Democratic Party, we wouldn't be having this trouble. I heard two Republicans at the end of Obama's presidency, and they said that there would be no Republican president that could do the things for the Republican Party that Barack Obama and Bill Clinton did. That says a lot.
I don't understand. I don't understand. What do you mean?
Okay. What they're saying is the many, many things that Barack Obama did under the scope that people don't know about, fairness doctrine, the things, the TPP, many, many, many things, okay? He did his great speeches to cover them all, and they did. They covered them all, okay? And he really never did nothing for the blacks.
So what you're saying basically is that Bill Clinton and Barack Obama governed like, Eisenhower-era Republicans, and then the Republican presidents that we've had since Reagan have governed basically like Reagan, like Lochner-era Republicans.
Okay. No, I'm saying is they said more or less with Barack Obama in there and what Bill Clinton did with the Telecommunications Act and all the other corporate stuff they both did that the regular people did not know was more of Republican stuff than any Republican in power could have done for the Republicans. Yeah. Because the Democrats would not go against the Democrat, even though he was doing that sort of stuff.
Well, I wouldn't frame it that way, and I wouldn't characterize it that way. I think that, some very good things happened during both the Clinton and Obama administrations, and some very bad stuff happened during both those administrations, and you've identified a number of them. But they would not have happened if the Republicans and beyond the Republicans, if this entire right-wing infrastructure of think tanks and media and educational systems and lobbyists and PR agencies and book publishers, if this entire right-wing ecosystem that's all literally subsidized by a handful of right-wing billionaires, if that didn't exist, and the Republican Party hadn't been pushing Bill Clinton, for example, to deregulate the media in 1996 with the Telecommunications Act, or pushing Clinton to join NAFTA and to enter into the what ultimately became the World Trade Organization, for example. It started out with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Taxes, the GATT. I frankly don't think that Clinton would have done those things. I don't think Obama would have done some of the things he did if the Republicans hadn't been pushing it that hard. So, yeah, you can make a point that we've had, a couple of presidents who didn't do everything we would like and even did some regressive stuff. But I'm not willing to blame the Democratic Party for any of this. The Democratic Party is moving in a progressive direction right now. They were like I said, they were kind of stuck in being 1950s Republicans for 20 years. And I think they're shaking it off. I think that's a good thing. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Chris in Oakland, California, listening on AM 910 and not of San Francisco. Chris, what's on your mind?
Yeah, boy, I'm in Oakland. It was great to have you back on AM, Tom.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you. So
actually, we should all thank iHeartRadio. They made it happen. So bless them. So what's up, right. What's up, Chris?
I like them. So we're talking about these changes. We're comparing and contrasting these changes between the FDR era and this era, and how there's significant impacts on the society. And there's one point that it comes to me that I think is very relevant, that I think has been missed, and that is that when the changes that came into effect under FDR with the New Deal and all the those were progressive changes that by and large helped a large majority of the country. Now, obviously, the right wing the Republicans have an artificial influence through the money and the laundering and Citizens United and gerrymandering and all their other tactics. But the changes that are almost certainly, unfortunately, about to come about during this era are going to be, by and large, regressive changes that I believe are going to hurt a mass majority of the people. And to the Republicans who are exercising and practicing this, what I call political hedonism at this point, I would just warn them that history is watching. And when you hurt the people enough, when they finally hurt people enough to get people to pay attention, I think it's going to hurt at first and it's going to suck for a while, but I think there's going to be massive retribution on a scale that they just won't be able to artificially combat. Well, and I'm not talking about the shooting war. I'm talking about people in the streets and going to the polls and waiting in the rain, waiting in the rain in Cleveland for 8 hours to vote and doing what they have to do to make their own lives better. When people finally wake up and realize they can't tweet or internet post or anything else their way to a better life, that they've got to go and vote, I believe there's going to be a backlash, and I think it's going to be significant.
Chris, I agree.
And I don't know what
but here's
going to destroy themselves.
Here's the problem. I mean, if we look back at history, and I think looking back at history is a good impulse. It's not always right, and history doesn't. What's the old saying? History doesn't repeat itself; it rhymes. In other words, you see the same themes, but they're played out in different ways. But the Great Depression of 1929 to 1933, what was referred to in the press in the United States up until the 1950s as the Republican Great Depression, and then when Eisenhower was elected, they all stopped referring to it as the Republican Great Depression. But that's what FDR always called it. It's what Harry Truman always called it. The Republican Great Depression didn't just impact the United States; it impacted Europe as well, which had been ravaged by World War I on top of it. And so when that happened, when the economy really reached its peak crisis moment, which was 1933, we installed into the White House Franklin Roosevelt, and Germany installed into the chancellor's office or into the functional prime minister, what would be Angela Merkel's position today, Adolf Hitler. And both of them were populists. Both of them ran on a platform of, I'm going to help the people. And Hitler did. He rebuilt German industry. He built the Autobahn. His people invented the Volkswagen, and they created a whole car industry. He helped industry tremendously. He radically cut their taxes. He gave them free labor with the labor camps, where he was putting first trade unionists and then communists and then gay people and then Jews ultimately, into these labor camps. The hundreds of camps inside Germany, none of them were the, quote, ovens death camps. They worked people to death, and they had, typhoid epidemics and things like that. But it wasn't like Auschwitz. I mean, he was providing free or cheap labor to these giant German companies, and they loved him for it. Fritz Thyssen wrote this book, I Paid Hitler, which I've been reading now for, on and off for the last 6 months. And it's just shocking, And so both countries had this populist response, and it was a right-wing populist response in Germany, and it was a left-wing populist response in the United States. And it worked out well for us, and it worked out badly for Germany. But now we have the problem of, if we have a crash right now, and Donald Trump or some other populist on the right, really exercises that kind of power like Hitler did, or Mussolini did, or Franco did, who all of these countries were suffering under the Great Depression, then, it could be far worse. I mean, it could get really, really messy, and we could end up losing what we have, what we call democracy. Chris, your point is very well taken. Thanks for the call, and thanks for listening to AM 910 in San Francisco, or you're being in Oakland. I appreciate it. We'll be back. It's coming up on the top of the hour here.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Thom Hartmann Program is also brought to you by Cameron Hughes Wines. Cameron Hughes scours the world looking for the finest wines. You can get more information about Cameron Hughes and his wines at chwine.com/Thom, T-H-O-M. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair office chair. xchairthom.com is the website, xchairthom.com. Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. More information is available over at thomsbeets.com, THOMSBEETS.com, or by calling 800-568-9889. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Seize the Time, the story of the Black Panther Party and Huey P. Newton by Bobby Seale. This is from page 85, a subchapter titled Huey Backs the Pigs Down. And there are a few words in here that I'll be filling in, as it were. They're walking. He says, one day as we were walking out of the office, I guess we'd been there about a month or so, a pig passed by. He saw us coming out of the office with shotguns and pistols on our sides. About 6 or 7 of us came out of the office there in the daytime, and we looked at the pig as he passed by, and he jumped on his radio because he saw us coming out of the office with these pieces and stuff. We had just finished field stripping weapons, learning about 00 buckshot, learning about the 9mm and the .45, and having a political education session. We had a .45 and a .357 Magnum in the group and a couple of M1s. We had 3 or 4 shotguns by then. We bought up guns like a son of a bitch then. The pig went down 2 blocks and turned around, came back up the other side of the street. They were building rapid transit, BART, right down from Grove Street there, and we went up the other side of the boulevard and came back. We readily assessed that the pigs were ready to see what the F was happening, that this pig had radioed in, and he was running it down, how he had, quote, seen some N-words come out of a place here with some guns and blop, blop, de bloop, etc., come out of this office with guns and stuff. He was radioing into other pigs to help get them. Huey had his father's car that day, and he goes through that whole thing. So anyhow, the police pull him over, and Huey got in the car, and the pig came up to the window. You have any driver's license? So Huey rolled the window down. That wasn't more than a 3 or 4 inch crack in the window. Huey handed his license out the window. Is this your true name, the pig said? And Huey said, yes, that's my true name, Huey P. Newton. Is this your true address, 841 47th Street? And Huey said, yep, that's my true address, 841 47th Street. And what are you doing with the guns? And Huey said, what are you doing with your gun? This particular pig decided he wasn't going to argue, so he went back and got his little writing pad there where they fill out S-word. Your true name is Huey P. Newton? Huey said, that's right. The pig wrote it down. Your true address is 841 47th Street? Huey said, that's right. The pig then looked at his license. What's your phone number? And Huey said, 5, and stopped and wouldn't say anything else. And the pig said, 5 what? And this is when all the S-word between the pig and the party and the pigs began. Huey said, the Fifth Amendment. You ever heard of it? Don't you know about the constitutional right of a person not to testify against himself? 5, I don't have to give you anything but my identification, name, and address, so therefore I don't even want to talk to you. You can leave my car and leave me alone. I don't even want to hear you. What do you mean, the pig said. And Huey said, just what I said. The constitutional right of any man is that he doesn't have to testify against himself. And Huey had a big M1 sitting to his right with his hand on it. I had this 9mm sitting beside me, and Huey had this M1 at his side. Huey was driving. 4 other brothers were in the back seat. One of them was Bobby Hutton. They were being quiet because Huey told them to be quiet. And the pig is going crazy. He's by himself, and Huey's got all these black N-words in the car going for the MFer. Meanwhile, while the pig is trying to get bad, 3 cars drove up behind us and 1 in the front. Some more were in the driveway. Blop, blop, blop de blue. Then another car came in front of us. A pig jumped out of the car, walked up to our car, and said through the crack in the window with a hoggish voice trying to sound intimidating, what's going on here? And Huey said, the same basic procedures that are supposed to go on. Huey rolled the window down another 5 or 6 inches. The pigs were looking at the guns in the car. Can I see that pistol there? One of the pigs said. No, you can't see it, Huey told him. I was beginning to get skeptical about what was happening because he pointed to my 9mm pistol. Huey was on probation, and if they thought that this was Huey's pistol, I didn't know this law stuff the way Huey knew it, so I moved the pistol over beside me real close. It had been lying in the middle of the seat. I said, no, you can't see it. Huey said, no, you can't see the pistol, nor this, pointing to his rifle. And you don't want to look, and I don't want you to look at it. You don't have to look at it. Is that your pistol? He asked Huey. And I said, no, it's not his pistol, it's my pistol. I said that because I was thinking the man's going to jump on Huey because he already told me about the probation law. If he gets caught with a pistol, he's burned. But if he gets caught with a rifle, the man can't mess with him because his probation officer told him he can carry a rifle or shotgun, and he couldn't stop him. The pig said, can I see it or not? So Huey said to me, I'll talk. And then he said to the pig, no, you can't see the pistol. Get away from the car. We don't want you around the car, and that's all there is to it. Well, I can ask him if I can see his pistol or not, the pig says. So I says, well, you can't see my pistol. The MFers tried to get indignant. They were blabbing and oinking to each other about who in the hell we thought we were, and Constitution my ass, they're just turning it around. Then the pig said to Huey, who the hell do you think you are? Look, damn it, Huey said. He opened the car door. This is where Huey got mad. I mean, you have to imagine this N-word. He got mad because these dogs were going to carry on, and they were bracing up like they were bad. Huey didn't go for this at all. Huey got very mad. He opened up the door saying, who the hell do you think you are? In the first place, this man, pointing at the pig, came up here and asked me for my license like he was citing me for a ticket or observation of some kind. This police officer is supposed to be carrying out his duty, and here you come talking about our guns? Huey put his hand around his M1 rifle and continued, we have a constitutional right to carry the guns, and anyway, I don't want to hear it. The pigs backed up a couple of steps, and Huey was coming out of the car. Huey had his hand back in the car getting his M1, and you know, if you've ever seen Huey, he gets growly but articulate. He came out of the car with his M1. Huey knows this law so well that he wouldn't have had the one M1 loaded inside the car. So he came out of the car, he dropped around into the chamber right away. Clack, clop. Who do you think you all are anyway? Huey said to the pigs. And the pigs were all on the sidewalk harassing all the brothers and sisters who gathered around. You move on down the street, said the pig. Huey started interrupting. You don't have to move down the street. Don't go anywhere. These pigs can't keep you from observing. You have a right to observe an officer carrying out his duty. And these pigs, they listen to all this S-word, and it goes on from there. It's a great story. Seize the Time by Bobby Seale.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And welcome back. And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And on the line with us is Professor Nancy MacLean. She is the William Chafee Professor of History and Public Policy at Duke University, the author of 5 books. Her most recent, and in fact, we've had her on about this, and we did a little book report on this book that's in circulation, and you can see over on YouTube, on our youtube.com/Thom Hartmann. This is an amazing book. It's Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right Stealth Plan for America. Nancy, welcome back to the program.
It's great to be back with you, Tom.
Thanks. You know, when you and I talked, when your book first came out, I had not read the entire book. I'd read maybe a third of it. And I was very impressed by it. I thought it was great. I think, you know, the history you were doing, digging up all those old documents and finding finding out about, this guy who was kind of at the center of all this. But I finally finished it a couple of weeks ago, and I read in your last chapter, you talk about how these guys who are financing the hard right, the Kochs, the Mercers, this whole bunch of right-wing billionaires, actually, I want to ask you. You used the word favela, as I recall, or barrio, in that last chapter, and said that they envision, or their policies envision, and I'd love you to clarify it for me, that America would begin to look like Mexico City. That instead of just slums, we would have massive architectures of handmade, homemade cardboard houses. And frankly, this is, I live in Portland, Oregon now. I used to live in D.C. I'm seeing this happen. We call it homeless encampments, right? Where you've got a park with, 200 people living in it. And I saw it in Hawaii, in Honolulu. There's a giant park, and it's basically been taken over. It's turned into a little city. It's an American version of a favela. Can you speak to that and how much worse that might get if we get a Lochner-type Supreme Court justice out of Donald Trump who says, hey, I'm keeping in mind the Lochner Court, the Supreme Court actually from 1897 and 1937 struck down child labor laws, struck down the right to unionize laws, struck down environmental protections, struck down workers' rights, struck down minimum wage. All these things, if we get another court like that and it starts doing this, and they've already gutted our Voting Rights Act and other things, and of course Citizens United, if we get this, this could be America. I mean, speak to that and how these guys who are funding all this think that's a good thing.
Yes. I have to say, from the research that I did, Tom, and what I've learned, since publication that has confirmed it, Americans do not understand at all how radical this Koch-led donor network project to transform our public life is. It is so radical that, as you say, essentially they see the world of capitalism, early 19th century capitalism as described by Charles Dickens, as a good thing, right? So they think that government should only have 3 functions. It should ensure the rule of law, it should guarantee social order, and it should provide for the national defense. Other than that, government has no place in their order. So government should not be allowing minimum wages. What's that?
Courts, cops, and the Army. That's it. That's all they should do.
Exactly. Courts, cops, and the Army. That's a good way to put it. Yes. So government should not be providing things like Social Security or Medicare. It should in no way be buttressing workers' rights to organize collectively, because for workers to organize collectively is to them a form of gangsterism, right? It shouldn't be allowed. Everybody should have their compensation decided by their market value. So if you are not particularly well trained, or you didn't do well in school, or you stayed home to raise your kids and now you're re-entering the labor force, tough on you, you will fall to the bottom, and that will be your fault. So it really, these are people who thought that Scrooge was right? There's actually an article I found to that effect.
Oh, well, actually Russell Kirk wrote about this in 1951, or 52, I think it was, and basically pointed out that that was one of the most stable, politically, one of the most stable eras in the history of the last millennia. Was, you had a very, very small a very, very small super rich class, a very, very small middle class, which Scrooge was a member of, by the way. Scrooge was, he was a small business owner with a single employee. He ran a smaller company than mine. And so he was the middle class shop owner kind of thing. And then you have this huge class of the working class with maximum wage laws to prevent them from acquiring enough wealth that they could then have political power. and they view this as the most stable system. It's basically a variation on serfdom. Back to you, Nancy. Forgive my interrupting.
Yes, absolutely, and with no popular participation or very limited popular participation, and that's why the voter suppression, the extreme gerrymandering to let these Republican elected officials choose their voters rather than vice versa, why all of these radical rules changes are essential to make this work. And we should add here that not only has this cause ensured that Mitch McConnell in the Senate gave them a Supreme Court seat that should have gone to the previous president, but they are also organizing for a constitutional convention, the first state-convened constitutional convention.
Right, and there are 2 states short of that
lined up. 28 of 34 states needed to do that. So this cause is so serious about radically changing the rules. They see democracy and capitalism, or at least democracy as we've known it over the 20th century, as antithetical, right? That democracy is a problem for capitalism, democracy as we've known it. So they want to radically change the rules in order to achieve the kind of dominance that they see as their due. So Americans really need to understand this. I know people are overwhelmed. Many people are working 2 jobs. They've got sandwich crisis between kids and grandparents. There's so many things going on in people's lives. But what happens over the next, 1 to 3 years is going to be decisive for the future, for as long as we can foresee, because these guys are so determined to bring about permanent radical rules change. So we have to be paying attention.
Let me ask you to put your prophet hat on, your analyst, looking forward into the future, which you talk about a little bit toward the end of the book. And we're talking with Nancy McLean, the author of a book that you have to read. It's called Democracy in Chains. It's just an absolute expose of how we got where we are and where they're trying to take us. What happens if the court rolls back Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid? They've already rolled back, union protections, does away with environmental protections, but particularly those things that would hit the middle class really hard, really fast. And the wealthy states, California, New York, the populous states, pick these things up and say, okay, we're going to, because the court, this is the whole thing of the court, the 10th Amendment, just let the states do it, right? Let them figure out how they want to administer it. So we end up with a dozen or so states that are populous enough and wealthy enough that they can actually fund good schools, and they end public schools, right, and things like that, which they want to do. I mean, it's part of their agenda to end public schools. So let's say that they do this and it goes to the states, and we end up with a dozen or more states that become sort of like European countries, good places to live, and then we've got another 20 or 30 states that are these so-called red states, where people are living in poverty, they're oppressed by their employers, they have no health care. Right now in Mississippi, we've got infant mortality rates that are similar to those of most third world countries. At what point does this turn into civil war, or at what point does this turn into a country being torn apart?
Yeah, it's good that you raised that, because that's something that's been on my mind too. The people who are the architects of this cause think in a very cold, logical way, and think that they can manipulate the environment and people endlessly to achieve their goals. But I think that you're absolutely right, that they are tearing our country apart. They are deliberately turning us against one another. They are using racism strategically, as in promoting the myth of widespread voter fraud, in which it's suggested that it's people of color who shouldn't be voting, et cetera. So this is really, really scary, high-stakes stuff. And this is also a cause we need to understand, and I found in my research, that came together in the late 1950s in the Jim Crow South, a cause that thinks nothing of using such racism strategically in order to move their project of economic liberty, and that also advocates actions on the spectrum of secession, as someone I wrote about puts it, in order to achieve the will of capital. So they would like nothing better than to have mass secession, right? Because that decreases the collective power of the people through things like labor unions and the AARP and, government and stuff, and increases the power of capital. So this is highly calculated. It is deeply strategic. And another thing for you to know, though, too, is you're talking about those states like California and New York. These guys are so strategic that one of the things they built into the Trump tax bill was a measure to make it so that wealthy people in states like New York and California could no longer deduct their state and local income taxes. So that is deliberate deliberate social engineering in order to turn the wealthy people of those states against things like good public schools, health care protections, and so forth. And one of the strategists for this project, Stephen Moore, who's worked with the Heritage Foundation and many, many other groups, the Wall Street Journal, has said that if the wealthy people, taxpayers in those states don't like it, they should just move. So I think what we have to realize is that the right that we are dealing with now in America is playing an incredibly strategic, integrated, multi-part long game, whereas the left has been siloed, reactive, not seeing the whole picture, not articulating a big, overarching message, and it is really time to get serious, to understand what the other side is about, and to think about how we are going to protect, and I'm not exaggerating here, the popular achievements of the 20th century. Yeah. From the progressive era through the New Deal, through the civil rights era, the environmental era, and more. All of those things are now at risk.
Well, all of those things are actually not just at risk. Scott Pruitt is
being undermined as we speak. Yeah.
Scott Pruitt's tearing apart the EPA. Ryan Zinke is selling off public lands. Mick Mulvaney is destroying banking regulations and consumer protections. Donald Trump is openly promoting racism. I mean, it's just the whole thing. It's like a whole cloth.
I think in some ways too. I think people on the progressive side, and this includes our elected officials, sometimes get overwhelmed by the sheer number of radical rules changes happening, and we can get into the weeds with those particular changes. And I think what the American people need to understand is the big picture of all of this, of where it's going. And the big picture of all of this is that Charles Koch himself has been very clear that the kind of world he wants to bring in is not desired by the majority of the people. He actually said at the time he really started working on this in earnest in 1997, 98, he said, since we are greatly outnumbered, the failure to use our superior technology ensures failure. So he's basically admitting that nobody wants this libertarian world, right? People are not going to vote for it. They're not going to ask for it. They're going to run from it if they understand it. And that is why this cause is using a strategy.
Nancy, we're hitting a break here, but you're absolutely right. And the book is Democracy in Chains. Hang on just a second, Nancy.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
He always steps on me. Nancy McLean, Democracy in Chains. Nancy, thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom.
It's great talking with you. We'll be back. And welcome back. Continuing our conversation, and I think, we've kind of set this up. Darius in Newburgh, Indiana. Am I saying your name right, Darius? Watching Free Speech TV? Or is it Dennis? Darius? Oh, apparently, whoever it is, he's watching his TV rather than listening to his phone. Call us back. Gail in Tucson, Arizona, watching us on Free Speech TV. Hey, Gail, what's up?
Hi, Tom. Thank you. Thank you so much for your intelligent and heartfelt offering. I love your show.
Thank you.
I appreciate your book club. Today you read from The Fourth Turning, a book often quoted by my mentor, Daniel Giamario, who is the creator of the Shamanic Astrology Mystery School, of which I'm a member.
Fascinating.
I also support the maintenance of, astrological education in Tucson via the Tucson Astrologers Guild. One of our professional speakers over the last few years who's widely known, Nick Dagan Best, who's a researcher of planetary cycles and their correlation with history. He speaks and writes a lot about the cycle of Uranus and how when it is in Gemini, that is a period in which his country has always been at war. In light of what you were talking about earlier this morning, I thought it was so relevant that I had to call you, because Uranus was in Gemini during the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War II, and Uranus enters Gemini in mid-2025. People can find out more about what he says in his book, What's Up, Uranus? Yeah. And he's found on YouTubes and podcasts and Twitter and everything.
That's fascinating.
Nick Dagan Best. But I hope you don't mind me injecting that in light of what your conversation.
It's fine. I want to get one more call in before the break here. But Gail, thank you for that. I'll keep an eye on it. I appreciate it. Dale in Nebraska. Hey, Dale. Thanks for watching Free Speech TV. What's up?
Yeah, Tom. Great show. The reason I called in is my wife and I are currently retired and moving from Nebraska to Arizona. Mm-hmm. We saw what a conservative governor type state looked like. Not appealing at all. A lot of the infrastructure is compromised. But your subject today was of great concern to me because one of the things that I agree with you with is what I'm witnessing of a ramping up of the rhetoric against the liberal or progressive. And in fact, in Arizona, we witnessed a bumper sticker on a car that said, "The only good liberal is the dead liberal."
Yeah, I've seen that.
And I assure you that guy probably had an AR-15.
Yeah.
So we were scared enough we moved back to Nebraska.
Wow. So you got out of Arizona just because the right-wingers frightened you, essentially?
Absolutely, Tom.
Wow. And the quality of life was deteriorating because it's been run by Republicans for 20 years or so, and they're not keeping up their infrastructure.
Right. Well, property taxes are real low, but then you don't get street lights and...
yeah, but isn't Nebraska a red state too?
Pardon me?
Isn't Nebraska a red state too?
Well, it is, but it's nothing like that.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of these farm states have a long history of barn building, basically communities coming together, and so they might be a little more resistant to this. That's fascinating. That's very fascinating. Dale, thanks a lot for the call. It's great to hear from you, and thank you so much for watching Free Speech TV. We'll be right back.
Indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees on the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Thom Hartmann Program is also brought to you by Cameron Hughes Wines. Cameron Hughes scours the world looking for the finest wines. You can get more information about Cameron Hughes and his wines at chwine.com/Tom, Thom. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair chair, office chair. xchairtom.com is the website, xchairthom.com. Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. More information is available over at thomsbeets.com, thomsbeets.com, or by calling 800-568-9889.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you and Richard in Montana. Hey, Richard, what's on your mind today? Richard? No, Richard. To everybody, you've got to listen to your telephone because there's a time delay. You know, there's the obscenity delay, and then it takes time for the signals to get to the satellites and all that. I mean, much of it runs at the speed of light, but a lot of it doesn't. Bill in St. Helens, Oregon. Hey, Bill, what's up?
Hey, Tom. Last year we had a constitutionally defining moment with the Constitution of the United States, and we lost such a major opportunity. It should have been this simple. We let a member of one branch of our government, the legislative branch, redefine the constitutional authority of the executive branch. Mitch McConnell publicly stated he didn't think the American people would want Obama to appoint anybody in his last year. Right. Mitch McConnell had no such authority to make that decision.
Well, he was quoting Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer, and I thought those quotes were kind of bogus. But the Washington Post on their front page right now has the video of those things, and it's pretty startling. What it's kind of depressing. But anyhow, back to you, Bill.
Tom, had Joe Biden talked about it. Let's give that a given.
Yeah.
He talked about it.
And
had he and the Democrats tried to pull that, I would have been leading the charge for constitutional usurpation and impeachment of these people. So let's not talk about shoulda, woulda, coulda. This man did it.
Yeah.
He should have been impeached immediately by the Republican Congress, immediately, but he wasn't. Hence the Democrats, and I'm sure they've got all kinds of little rules in the Senate that don't allow the minority party to do this. Doesn't matter. The Democrats have a duty to the American people, not their Congress first. So the Democrats should have immediately started having for impeachment proceedings against both Mitch McConnell and every single Republican that was not calling and supporting impeachment. That didn't happen. Tom, that was the defining moment, in my opinion, that was a defining moment in history where we the people said, if you are not going to represent us, if you're not going to hold yourselves accountable, we need to talk about removing you.
Yeah.
And you talk. I talk.
Well,
about
and the president of the United States at the time, Barack Obama, should have been shouting this from the rooftop. And frankly, in my opinion, he shouldn't have put up a Republican as a nominee. He put in Merrick Garland specifically because Orrin Hatch asked him to, and Orrin Hatch assured him that Republicans would vote on this guy. And if he had put up a genuine progressive, someone like Sotomayor or Kagan, who he also put up, if he had continued that, he would have had progressive Democrats across the United States in the streets. But because it was Merrick Garland, I don't think, I think people were like, well, so he's a Republican. We'll be back. Thanks for the call, Bill. Good points. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We're going to be back with Professor Richard Wolff after the bottom of the hour, and then Talk Media News. So we'll be back with your calls in about a half hour. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Carbon Shock, A Tale of Risk and Calculus on the Front Lines of a Disrupted Global Economy by Mark Shapiro. This is from the introduction. Chaos, uncertainty, unpredictability. Those are the characteristics of the natural world under the pressures being wrought by climate change. Normal patterns of rainfall, temperature, and extreme weather are changing so rapidly that past baselines for these primordial forces are less and less relevant. Scientists have a word for this state of flux. They call it, quote, the end of stationarity, end quote, a term with a powerful meaning. We can no longer rely on past events to predict future probabilities. The ground is shifting beneath our feet. Now it's becoming increasingly clear that the volatility we're seeing in our natural world is reshaping our financial world too. While we try to hold on to our bearings in the status quo and conduct business as usual, new risks are entering into the equation, and new costs are creeping out of the balance sheets of corporations and nations. Just as chaotically as climate change is altering conditions here on Earth, it is changing our understanding of the actual costs of just about everything. In the financial realm, as in the natural realm, the past provides fewer and fewer clues to our future. Like the migration patterns of songbirds that no longer correlate to the hatching patterns of their insect prey, or the mountain snowpacks that no longer store water for the dry summer months. The economy is facing similar miscues born of the interactive loop between tumult in the atmosphere and tumult on the earth. Economic calculations are being upended in ways that are similar to how the digital revolution transformed financial decision-making, though on a far more monumental scale. In early 2014, a report by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, produced and reviewed by more than 1,000 scientists and approved by 194 governments, identified the economic impact of the enormous changes underway. Slowing the rate of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere would not have devastating impacts on the economy, as is often feared, but would require a fundamental rethinking of our priorities and of our existing business models. Unstated but clearly implied, new forces will rise and others will fall as the true costs of carbon become an increasingly potent economic factor that can no longer be ignored. In 2013, an insurance industry research association called for an entirely new paradigm for assessing risk because rapid-fire changes in weather and temperature are outpacing traditional actuarial calculations. In other words, we are on the threshold of carbon shock. There are 5 greenhouse gases. Together, these gases of related, though different provenance, are in a circuit of relationships that give them the same ultimate impact, trapping heat in the Earth's lower atmosphere, giving rise to the greenhouse effect. Up from the center of the Earth comes a 100-billion-year-old periodic table of decaying organic fossils in the form of carbon dioxide and methane, embedded in oil, coal, and natural gas, thus the terms fossil fuels. From the combustion of these ancient fossils comes O3, also known as ozone, derived from the interaction of sunlight with CO2 and other hydrocarbons, and O2, nitrous oxide, which in addition to being emitted from, from industrial sources, is also contained in fertilizers and released from soil through agricultural tilling, and a synthesized family of hydrofluorocarbons generated as waste products from the production of other chemicals, primarily refrigerants and pesticides. In the gas world, they are all cousins, baton passers of molecular reaction that conspire to create turmoil in the heavens. Carbon dioxide is by far the most abundant, which is why carbon has become a stand-in reference for all greenhouse gases. It's not that carbon hasn't always had a cost. It's just that, until now, carbon's costs have been, for the most part, invisible. We haven't been accounting for them. Just as an optical illusion tricks the eye into seeing something that's not there, traditional accounting diverts our attention from invisible costs. We only see profits. Keeping these costs a mystery has been fundamental to our economic growth. Businesses benefit from a false ledger in which the environmentally corrosive impacts of the energy they use to produce, distribute, and dispose of everything from almonds to automobiles have been dramatically undercounted. 3,000 of the world's biggest companies, according to the United Nations report, could lose a third or more of their value if calculations of profits included the actual environmental costs. Most of these costs are the result of greenhouse gases emitted from the burning of fossil fuels, from which 82% of the world's energy is derived. Unlike smog or smoke or other acute contaminants, you can't necessarily see greenhouse gas pollution, but we are the involuntary recipients of its steadily expanding effects. These effects come to us fractured in scattered reports of distress, polar bears floating off on melting glaciers, hurricanes tearing into distant coastlines, droughts sending farmers into panic, remote island states sinking into the seas. When, in the summer of 2013, a gas chromatograph perched atop the Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii reported that the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere had, for the first time, reached 400 parts per million, it not only triggered alarm bells from scientists, but signaled costs to come. The world's two biggest economies, the United States and the European Union, estimate hundreds of billions of dollars in cost from heat waves, floods, and an accelerating flow of refugees fleeing lands in which they can no longer sustain themselves. Both classify climate change as one of the Welcome back to the place where smart people get their news from smart people like Richard Wolff. Professor Richard Wolff is on the line with us, the economist, the co-founder of Democracy at Work, author most recently of Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays on the Global Economic Meltdown. His website, democracyatwork.info or rdwolf with 2fs.com. You can tweet him at Prof. Wolff, PROFWOLFF. Dr. Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
It is so nice to have you with us. I wanted to conflate two issues and drop them in your lap and get your thoughts on it. On the one hand, we are very close to, in my opinion, returning to a Lochner-era court where everything literally from Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, workman's compensation, unemployment compensation, workplace safety rules, all of these, environmental regulations, all of these things could simply be struck down by the court and revert to the states, where we might end up with California and New York being nice places to live and the rest of the country turning into Bangladesh. So we've got that on the one hand. And then on the other hand, we've got this piece in today's Washington Post that points out that we're already halfway there. Only, and I'm quoting this by Andrew Van Dam, and it's titled, "It's Great to Be a Worker in the U.S." No, not compared with the rest of the developed world. And they looked at us versus all the other 34 OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the 34 richest countries. Only Spain and Greece, ravaged by the Eurozone crisis, have more households earning less than half the nation's median income, and the United States. The United States and Mexico are the only countries that don't require advance notice for individual firings. We rank at the bottom of employee protections for mass layoffs. When you lose your job, and in the United States, I'm quoting from this article, it's harder to find another. Even when Americans do find another job, their earnings don't recover. U.S. unemployment benefits provide less support in the first year of unemployment than those in any other country in the world. Only 12% of U.S. workers are covered by the unions' collective bargaining. We're down there with Turkey and Lithuania. And workers' share of national income has dropped 8 percentage points since 1995. That puts us right there with Poland. Where does this lead? What does this mean for this country?
Well, it does. It speaks to several things. For the first, it clarifies what seems to mystify all kinds of commentators. That on the one hand, we have an official unemployment rate as low as it has been able to get for most of the post-World War II period. On the other hand, we have an enormous part of our population bitter, angry, dissatisfied, and able to point to a pinched standard of living, notwithstanding these unemployment numbers. And this is supposed to be a mystery. But of course it isn't, as the OECD documents and the Washington Post story make so clear. Because the minute you go beneath the gross number, the aggregate number of unemployed, and look at what people are actually doing, then you quickly discover that over the last 25 years, good jobs, that is, jobs that are secure, jobs that have plenty of benefits, jobs that are interesting and take place in an environment that doesn't make you sick, have been given up and lost by the tens of millions to be replaced by jobs that are insecure, even to the point of not knowing, as millions of Americans don't, how many hours they'll work next week, whether those hours will be consistent with their child care responsibilities or not. Excuse me. They don't have any benefits to speak of, including the future, the pension that they may have to face in the years ahead. And so, yes, they have a job, but everything that a job was supposed to provide has been taken away or at least reduced. And so you have this upset, this anger, this bitterness. And what the Washington Post story nicely also adds to this is that we are at the bottom of the heap, as your comparisons showed, when it comes to doing anything for people who are either unemployed or are faced with jobs that can't provide them with enough. The government has been cut back. And I think it is not anymore, as it used to be, an exaggeration to say what you said about New York and California and maybe a few other places being the favored places and the rest of the country a kind of neglected backwater. That scenario that exists in countries we used to think were light years behind us is now coming home like chickens to roost, because we have a government so completely run by and subservient to corporate America that they will do anything to save the costs and to increase the profits of those who are their patrons, and to let the chips fall where they may. And all the Washington Post did today was show you where those chips are and who they're falling on.
You are not only an economist, I think of you as a, we don't have a good kind of secular word for it, but a prophet or a seer. In other words, you're able to look at the trends of history, long trends, multi-generational trends, multi-century trends of history, put them in both an economic and a political frame and draw conclusions that could be called predictive. The question I've been asking for the last hour and a half on this program is, are we on the verge of, or are we already there, of this country literally being torn apart? We had Nancy McLean on, the author of Democracy in Chains, and she talked about how one of these petro-billionaires was actually saying that he was in favor of individual states engaging in mass secession from the United States as another way of diminishing federal power and authority. To what extent do you think that we are looking at essentially a second civil war, not necessarily one where people are shooting at each other, although people actually are already killing each other. We had this woman killed in the Charlottesville, Virginia, tiki torch rally. But a tearing apart of this country that goes beyond simply, the reality right now that women living in Mississippi are more likely to die in childbirth in the United States than they are even in many third world countries. 300% more likely to die in childbirth than in Canada or in California. I mean, we're already sort of there, but, do you see this just ripping this country apart?
At this point, I think there is no basis other than to answer your question, yes. I come at it with the same kind of question, but a slightly different angle. In my head, as I look at history, I see glorious empires, the Greek, the Roman, the Russian, the British, and now the United States display the same situation, an explosive growth from humble beginnings, a revelation of the possibility of wealth beyond anything they had imagined, the enjoyment of that wealth, the beginning to see the accumulation of wealth pretty much as an end in itself, and then the inevitable overreach, the misunderstanding that the real wealth of a nation is always its people, not its machines, not its navy, etc., etc. And so then in each case, adventures abroad that become more difficult, more expensive, and can't be won. But even worse, using up resources that might otherwise have held the domestic society together but aren't available for that, so that the domestic conflicts are not managed. And so the two sides, foreign and domestic, feed each other, while those at the top, with wealth beyond their imaginations, keep thinking everything's okay, everything will work itself out, until that day comes when it all crashes. And I see that, and this is not me. I don't normally look like this about these things. I'm not an alarmist. I think history works slowly. But I have become convinced over the last several years that this time really is different, that we are not, we don't have a way out. I don't see one. And the conservative and middle-of-the-road economists that I speak with as a regular part of my life, we don't agree on how we got into this mess, and we don't agree on how to get out of it. But what we do agree on, which amazes us, is that this is the worst condition of the American economy that any of us have ever experienced in our lives, and we all have gray hair. So this is indeed a perception you have that a greater number of people are beginning to share. And with each passing day's headlines, you see more and more evidence. You mentioned a woman in the South. I was struck over the last few days by the story of the woman trapped by a subway in Boston who, in pain and bleeding, pleads with the people around her not to get the expensive ambulance because she can't afford it. Could they find her an ambulance that will get her to the hospital less expensively? I mean, it tore my heart out to understand we've reached that level of privation and inequality in this society.
Yeah, it truly is a disaster, sir. We have just 20 seconds, so we hit a hard break here. Jared Bernstein had invited me to the White House during the Obama presidency when he was the chief economist for Joe Biden, and we had a lengthy conversation and debate, frankly, about some of the policies. He's now saying he thinks a Great Depression is inevitable in the next year or two. Do you agree with that?
I think that if you push through these tariffs and trade wars, together with whatever else is going on, this is a dying empire flailing around, and it could set off cataclysms beyond anything we have foreseen.
Wow. Professor Richard Wolff, economist, co-founder of Democracy at Work, author of Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, democracyatwork.info. Thank you, Dr. Wolff.
Talk to you again soon, Tom.
Indeed.
Take care.
Thank you.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We'll be back with, we're going to be back with Bob Ney with Talk Media News in just a moment. Stick around. And welcome back, Jim in Toledo, Ohio, watching us on YouTube. Hey, Jim, what's up? Jim? Oh, it's that nasty delay thing. You've got to listen to your telephone, not what you're seeing on your TV screen or your computer screen or whatever, because there's that time delay. Ricky in Nashua, New Hampshire. Hey, Ricky, what's up? Thanks for watching us on YouTube.
Oh, thank you. How's it going? One thing that I've been doing the last month or two, and especially with the possible hard right shift again in the Supreme Court, talking to these single-issue abortion people, and they are woefully unaware. I mean, many of them do not seem to know that I think partial birth abortion was banned in 2003 on like the federal level.
Well, it was,
they've also done,
what you're calling that, unless it's a medical emergency, was banned with Roe v. Wade.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Roe v. Wade established three-thirds to a pregnancy, 3 trimesters. And the first trimester, pretty much relatively speaking, you can get an abortion whenever you want it during that first trimester. Second trimester, there are some very specific requirements that states can impose, or arguably the federal government can. And in the third trimester, at that point, you basically have to demonstrate that the life of the mother is at stake, because that's viability. So the so-called partial birth abortion that these guys are all hysterical about only happens when the baby is so deformed or so dead that at that point the fetus that taking it out is less destructive than leaving it into the mother. I mean, that's just been going. That's since '73. This whole partial birth abortion thing is a canard.
Yeah. So basically, these guys were unknowingly arguing for the unnecessary deaths of mothers.
That's correct.
Wow.
That's correct.
That is. And no, for being single issue, they've done zero research. One thing I've done, though, is look at other countries, and you'd especially see that biggest examples are Latin America and I believe Poland now. Of course, that may change. A lot of protests going on over there.
Right.
But seeing the effects of this thing, number one, doesn't decrease abortion at all, and since it's coupled with right-wing hard right policies economically and everything, and that's really what drives a lot of voluntary abortions.
Yeah, well, what banning abortion does is it increases the deaths of young women who are pregnant who don't want to be pregnant. I mean, it's just because they will figure out a way to try and get an abortion, and there are time-tested methods, but if it's not done by a professional in a medical setting.
Women.
I'm sorry?
Yeah. The only people who end up going to jail in these countries are poor women who are just having a normal miscarriage, because they're just going to the hospital saying, "Help me, I'm having a miscarriage," and next thing you know, they're getting accused of trying to have like a back alley abortion and get hauled off to jail for 10 or 20 years.
Well, you had Mike Pence when he was governor of Indiana proposing that every woman who has a miscarriage should report herself to the police, so that they can determine if the miscarriage was induced or not. In other words, was it an abortion? Did she punch herself in the stomach or something, and prosecute her? And also suggesting that every miscarriage should be buried in a cemetery, a $5,000 funeral, and we complete with birth certificate and everything. I mean, that was Mike Pence's position when he was governor of Indiana. This is how crazy it is. Ricky, thank you for the call. Great to hear from you. Thank you for watching us. We'll be back. It's 49. Well, it's 50 minutes, 10 minutes before the hour. Stick around. We'll be right back. Welcome back. It's 10 minutes before the hour. Thom Hartmann here with you, fair and only slightly unbalanced. I wanted to just share some really, really sad news with you all. My old friend, colleague, and competitor on various occasions, Ed Schultz, a decent man, a good and decent man, died last night, apparently in his bed in his home of natural causes. That is just so sad. And I want to reach out to his wife, Wendy, and to anybody who knows Ed. Keep his family, particularly Wendy, who is also struggling with cancer. Keep them in your prayers and your thoughts. And Ed, if you're listening, you were a good guy, and we're all going to miss you. Let's pick up the news here. Bob Ney is with us with Talk Media News. This report brought to you by goatsfortheoldgoat.com and Ellen Ratner's new book, Loving What You Do. Bob, happy birthday, Bob.
Oh, thank you. Next year's Medicare. I want to be 65 today. I'm 64.
Yeah. I gotta tell you, I've been on Medicare for 2 years, and it's spectacular.
Before there's health care completely gone, I want to get on Medicare.
Yeah. Get it before the Supreme Court strikes it down. Exactly. Anyhow, what's going on in the news, Bob?
It's a shame about Ed Schultz, by the way. I did his show once. Pretty cool guy.
Yeah, he is. He was a decent guy, and he and I, we had our differences,
sure.
When we were competing radio hosts. But I never disliked him, and he was a good guy.
Right.
It's so sad.
Yeah. Well, Supreme Court, and it's interesting, Tom, because I called a West Virginia station this morning, and I inquired from them, instead of giving news, asking news about Senator Manchin. They're going to have him on the show down there in Wheeling, West Virginia, WVLY. And so I was trying to get a feel from them of what he's going to do on the Supreme Court because, of course, as we know, Collins, the Republican senator from Maine, may, quote, defect from the Republicans. She may actually stand up for, the cause she believes in, which is a pro-choice cause. And also, this week in some money ads, Murkowski, the Republican senator from Alaska, and Collins are being targeted in some ads by NARAL and some other groups. On the other side, the right are targeting, of course, Senator Manchin of West Virginia, and that's why I asked about.
That's because he voted for Neil Gorsuch.
Well, yeah, he voted for Gorsuch. The response I got today, and he's going to be on one of the shows later, is that he was dancing around quite a lot.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
On this issue.
Yeah, these three red state Republicans or Democrats in the Senate who have been, occasionally voting with Republicans in the hopes that Republicans in their states will vote for them. I just,
right.
It's heart wrenching to see Heidi Heitkamp and
Donnelly.
Yeah, and Brian Donnelly and Joe Manchin. So Bob,
and then on that issue, it could be a 50. If the Democratic side holds firm and Collins does not vote, then the Supreme Court nominee goes down, even with the vice president.
So here's a question for you, Bob. I mean, you were a member of Congress for years and years, and in my opinion, one of the most politically astute. Your book, Sideswiped, is just a brilliant insight into how the House of Representatives works and your time there, and frankly, the crimes that were committed by Paul Ryan and others. Do you think that there's any possibility that Susan Collins or Lisa Murkowski would leave the Republican Party and become a Democrat over this?
I think there's more of a possibility Collins would. Look, when I came in with the Contract with America class, we saw Billy Tozan, I can name a few others that switched. A lot of heat was on them, and
they went from being Democrats to becoming Republicans because Republicans were the wave.
Right.
Yeah,
right. But I still think that it's possible that, in fact, Collins would be the one of anyone that could possibly switch.
So maybe the people listening to this program would call Congress's switchboard at 202-225-3121 and ask for Susan Collins' office, and then simply deliver the very simple message: Susan Collins, if you become a Democrat, I will support you. If it's somebody in Maine, if you become a Democrat, I will aggressively support you. I will show up. I will help. I'll volunteer. I'll walk door to door. If you're calling from California, you say, Susan Collins, if you become a Democrat, you're going to lose the money from the Republican Party, so I'll start contributing to your campaigns. Yeah.
And by the way, Tom, you really, President Obama this past weekend, when asked about what the tactics should be on the Democratic side, he said, go to the ballot box, get your people out, be activists, right?
Yes.
And he's correct. And what you just said, by the way, I served in Congress. And let me just say something. If only maybe 700 people in Maine, just 700 to 1,000, would handwrite a letter, by the way. When the staff gets a handwritten letter, that raises their eyebrows, because if somebody these days takes the time to handwrite a letter, if she could get handwritten letters, if she could get calls into her office, you're correct. That activism may just very well give her the ability to say, okay, I can do this without worrying about retaliation on me, because they would retaliate on her.
Right.
And it may give her the ability to make a conscience decision.
And if you're gonna handwrite a letter, then you have to deliver it in one of two ways. If you mail it to, if you go to collins.senate.gov, which is her website, you'll get the D.C. address. You'll also get her local addresses in Maine. If you mail it to the D.C. address, it'll take her 6 weeks to get it, because it's got to go through the anthrax processing system.
Office.
Right. So what you want to mail it to is one of the offices in the state of Maine, or if you are in Maine, you want to hand deliver it.
Correct. It will make a difference. I know people say, oh, I can't make a difference these days. That makes a difference. I can't tell you how much. And the phone calls in.
Yeah.
There's a lot of pressure there.
Yeah, and the number for the congressional switchboard, which will get you to Susan Collins' office, is 202-225-3121. You don't think Lisa Murkowski would switch? She's an independent now.
Well, I don't know. She might. I think Collins would be more likely.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
Yeah. Okay.
Likely to switch.
Okay, we have a little less than a minute, Bob. What else is up in the world?
Trump is going to dominate everything in the next 11 days, over to see the Queen, and there'll be protests, and then the Putin meeting, and he doesn't want, people in that meeting except the translators. I think it's a large risk for him. It is no risk for Putin whatsoever,
right,
but it would be for President Trump.
Well, I don't think it would be so much a risk for him as it would be a risk for the United States of America.
Well, yes, what he would say. The Venezuela story, by the way, I called some people up on Capitol Hill. That's a verified story where he actually raised with senior staff in front of Tillerson, who they said his jaw dropped, that, what would it take? How could they invade Venezuela?
The United States invade Venezuela? Trump proposed that?
Yes, he said that in August of 2017 in the Oval Office in front of Tillerson, and Tillerson, they said, about hyperventilated.
I can imagine. Holy cow. We are in deep trouble. Deep doo-doo here. Bob Ney with Talk Media News. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Tom.
Always great talking with you. We're going to be back with Dr. Ellen Littman. We're going to talk about ADHD in women. Stick around. This is going to be fascinating.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Thom Hartmann Program is also brought to you by Cameron Hughes Wines. Cameron Hughes scours the world looking for the finest wines. You can get more information about Cameron Hughes and his wines at chwine.com/Tom, T-H-O-M. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair chair, office chair. xchairtom.com is the website, xchairthom.com. Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. More information is available over at tomsbeets.com, THOMSBEETS.com, or by calling 800-568-9889. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Screwed, The Undeclared War Against the Middle Class, by me. This is Chapter 1, titled There Is No quote, free, end quote, market. Look at history and you'll find that the middle class was the creation of liberal democracies. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson did not fight a bloody war to create a country only for wealthy property holders. Our founders believed that every Bob Cratchit willing to work for his living should be able to earn enough to own his house and support himself and his family. That's what it means to be middle class, and part of why Jefferson put life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness into the Declaration of Independence. The founders also knew that a middle class doesn't just materialize out of thin air. That's why in the preamble to the Constitution, they wrote that one purpose of government was to, quote, promote the general welfare. 2 centuries later, when the middle class was in danger of disappearing during the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt almost single-handedly created a new middle class through his New Deal policies. Roosevelt's success demonstrates that government can and must promote the general welfare because only government can create the conditions that make a middle class possible. And FDR was able to do it only because of an overwhelming majority of Americans voted for it in a relatively free and open democracy. Listen to the right-wing pundits, the people I call the cons, and they will tell you something completely different. They suggest, and some actually believe, that a middle class will naturally spring into being when the kingdoms of corporate power are freed from government restriction. The way to create goods, according to the cons, is to free the market. When business gets to do whatever it wants, they say, it will create wealth, and that wealth will trickle down to the rest of us, thus creating a middle class. The cons' belief in free markets is a bit like the old Catholic Church's insistence that the Earth is at the center of the solar system. The free market line is widely believed by those in power, and those who challenge this belief are labeled heretics. But it's wrong. Here's a headline for those cons who are masquerading as economists without having studied either economics or history. 1, there's no such thing as a free market. And 2, markets are the creations of governments. Governments provide markets with a stable currency for financial transactions. They provide a legal infrastructure and a court system to enforce the contracts that make the market possible. They provide an educated workforce through public education. And those workers showed up at their places of business after traveling on public roads, rails, and airways provided by the government. Businesses that use the free market are protected by police and fire departments provided by the government, and they send their communications from phone to email over lines that follow public rights-of-way maintained and protected by the government. And most important, the rules of the game of business are defined by the government. Any sports fan can tell you that without rules and referees, football, baseball, basketball, and hockey would be a mess. Similarly, business without rules doesn't work. In a corporate kingdom, a corptocracy, those rules are made by the businesses themselves, and they inevitably screw both the workers and the citizens. In a democracy, those rules are made by we the people, both through our elected representatives and through union negotiations with the business kings, lords, and CEOs. The cons believe that what business is business, and the government should keep its nose out of it, even when the business is run by Ebenezer Scrooge and leads to centuries of sick Tiny Tims and terrified Bob Cratchits. Talk show cons and TV talking head cons and political cons, both Republican, conservative, or middle of the road, euphemisms for corporate connected, Democrats, say that government just gets in the way of the market. They want to let the market decide our economy. Unspoken is their belief that if economic and social policy are made by the market, we don't need government, the voice and the will of the people for our domestic affairs. One of the most vocal cons, Grover Norquist, told National Public Radio's Mara Liasson in a May 25, 2001 interview, "I don't want to abolish government. I simply want to reduce it to the size where I can drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub." During the golden age of the American middle class, people routinely voted themselves tax increases to invest in new schools, better roads, higher pay for police and firefighters, and a multitude of other infrastructure and public works projects. Hospitals were owned and run by local communities, as were water and sewage systems, and in most of the United States, power plants and other public utilities as well. Taxes, by and large, were thought of as investments in civil society and community, and were routinely embraced by the majority of the middle class. Of course, people made jokes about not liking taxes, but they still knew that without taxes, there'd be no services, and people wanted those services. Ronald Reagan and his public relations machine, funded by huge corporations and wealthy people like Joseph Coors, promoted the thought virus, the meme that taxes are bad and government is bad. Reagan ran as an outsider to government, although he was a former governor of California, and even ran for re-election as president against government. Reagan put forward the point of view of the wealthy elite who felt that they were paying large sums of their vast wealth to help the little people have good schools and communities that worked. He changed laws like the Fairness Doctrine in 1986 so the sycophants like Rush Limbaugh could appear in the public airwaves with heavy corporate funding to help convince the average person that taxes were bad and government was bad. Reagan stopped enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act, which since 1881 had held at bay the aggregation of corporate power, and the media began forming huge monopolies that were then used to reinforce on national TV and radio the perspectives of commentators like Limbaugh. The book is Screwed. The Undeclared War Against the Middle Class and What We Can Do About It by Thom Hartmann. Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. In the studio with us is Dr. Ellen Littman, an old friend and literally the world's leading expert on ADHD and women. She's a clinical psychologist licensed in New York State. She has been in the field of attentional disorders for over 27 years. She co-authored Understanding Girls with ADHD, a book, and is a contributing author of other books like The Hidden Side of Adult ADHD, Understanding Women with ADHD, and Gender Differences in ADHD. Ellen, welcome back to the program. It's been a year or so since you've been on with us, and it's great to have you.
About 4.
4 years, really? Wow, time flies. Yeah. Incredible. Well, I'm so glad that you're back and with us. We are looking at the possibility that the Supreme Court is going to roll back the rights of women to have an abortion, that broadly speaking, the Supreme Court could, a so-called conservative court, could become hostile to women in a whole lot of other ways, from the right to vote to the right to work to just this whole spectrum of stuff. And at the same time, women and girls are, particularly those with ADHD, are facing a whole panoply of challenges, many of which are unacknowledged. Where do we start with this conversation?
Okay, well, there's been a traditional look to ADHD that most clinicians and most of the lay public is familiar with, usually hyperactive boys. Mm-hmm. And it hasn't been well acknowledged that girls and women can have ADHD, and that presents very differently, and that we're finding that the outcomes are also very different and more negative for females.
So, for example, how ADHD in a boy, is, I think everybody understands. It's the kid who erupts in class, the kid who acts out, the kid who's the class clown, the kid who can't study, the kid who ultimately, very often fails or drops out tragically. The high IQ kids sometimes can push through, but it's brutal and painful. That's almost a stereotype. It's so well known. How does ADHD present itself in girls typically? Well,
we're finding that the majority of girls are actually not hyperactive, or certainly not hyperactive in an observable way. So they look very different. So they're most likely to be overlooked. And what we're discovering was that right now, in a clinic, 9-to-1 boys to girls. In the population, maybe 2-to-1 boys to girls. But in a clinic with adults who can self-refer, it's 1-to-1. So what we know is that we are missing a lot of girls. And by the time we do recognize them, or women self-refer, they have already suffered with undiagnosed ADHD for a long time and have developed a lot of dysfunctional coping mechanisms to help them along the way. And it makes the disorder even more complex when it does come to light.
So what's going on in the mind and life experience of, say, a teenage girl with ADHD who's in school and facing the challenges of ADHD, and why is it not so visible to their teachers?
And the girls that I'm particularly focusing on are the ones who are primarily inattentive type. In other words, they are not disruptive, and they may be a little chatty in class, but in general, they're more the passive, compliant, back in the day called space cadets, who are not being disruptive, so they're not really coming to anyone's attention. They may be doing an average performance in class, and no one is assuming maybe they could do much better. They're not problematic, but they feel different. They dread being called on. They feel confused. They process information more slowly, and gradually they start to withdraw and do not end up feeling effectual in their lives.
So we're basically destroying their potential to be successful adults.
Well, certainly the longer it goes unrecognized, it does get more and more serious. And as what we're finding out now, and this is fairly new research, is that estrogen is very much involved in the way ADHD presents in girls. So it really separates their trajectory completely from what boys are experiencing. So once estrogen comes into their systems,
that's post-puberty?
Yeah, their symptoms start to blossom and become more observable, but they tend to look more emotional in terms of volatility, moodiness, more anxiety, and that is easily misdiagnosed as anxiety disorder or some sort of depressive disorder, and they may be medicated inappropriately. And so that is another major point where you want clinicians to be thinking, maybe there's underlying ADHD, because that is where they become more problematic. They have more trouble in school in their attempt to find a way to connect with others and be able to conform in some way. They're drawn to things that will arouse their brains, not necessarily in a healthy way. So they're going to be more interested in drugs and alcohol, smoking cigarettes, early sexual experiences, and things that may derail them from performing in school.
Are we as a society? I mean, is this? I guess the essence of my question is, I guess, what do we do about this? And obviously we're failing these girls, and there's massive lost potential, particularly from the high. And I'd like you to address the difference between high IQ kids with ADHD and average kids with ADHD, girls in this case. But obviously we're losing extraordinary potential here. How should we respond beyond just teaching doctors that you shouldn't give antidepressants to somebody with ADHD because they're not depressed? That's not depression. Isn't the quote disease they have? It's the symptom of the underlying condition of ADHD.
Right.
But that's just one step. It seems like we need a much larger, more societal, structural change, like we're doing for boys with ADHD. I mean, we're actually changing our educational system in a lot of ways to accommodate boys with ADHD.
Well, it is part of a bigger picture. I mean, because the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, that is the American Psychiatric Association's Bible for diagnosis, is based on the behavior of young white boys. And the longer that we try to compare girls, especially inattentive girls or girls in different cultures, ethnicities, they all will not measure up on those criteria and will be deemed, as someone once said, ADD wannabes. They will not meet those criteria, but we're understanding now that nor should they, because girls and women have a lot of developmentally different behaviors, whether or not they have ADHD. For example, girls and women have more anxiety and depression in general than men and boys. So it is not surprising that ADHD exacerbates those tendencies.
Do you think that's a function of a society that essentially has historically made girls and women the property of men, and more recently at least makes them largely subordinate to men, or treats them as less than men?
Right. Well, yes, I think that is the the real underlying piece here. So that this is the experience of boys and men. That is been the precedent, and when you measure girls up against that yardstick, of course they will not meet those criteria, but nor should they. So the point is that we really need an entirely different set of criteria by which to measure ADHD girls and women against girls and women that don't have ADHD.
As opposed to against 7-year-old white boys.
Exactly. And while that may seem like a logical statement that I just made, it is only just becoming an issue that researchers are considering. So maybe only in the last 5 years, primarily, have researchers started to consider, okay, instead of comparing girls and women to boys and men, we're going to compare them to control girls and women with completely different results.
Yeah, I've often wondered, about my own ADHD, and I'll cop to it. I'm proudly raise my hand and say I'm a member of that tribe. That it was not my dad. My dad was actually, he worked in a tool and die shop for most of his life, but he did the bookkeeping for them. He taught Louise double entry bookkeeping when we started our first business. My dad was one of these very careful, very methodical, very focused. He was a farmer, and a very good one. My mom, on the other hand, was, the house was a disaster. Mom was a disaster in some ways. I mean, she was a wonderful and loving mother, and I was so lucky to have her as a mother. But when I look back now, and particularly through the prism or the lens of this diagnostic criteria that you're laying out for us for girls with ADHD, between her ADHD and the fact that she had 4 boys within 7 years, and all 4 of us, I think, at least 3 of the 4 of us, clearly classify, are my mom, our ADHD. Right. And maybe all 4 of us, I don't know, I'd have to discuss that with one of my other brothers, but in fact, actually, the one that I'm thinking wasn't ADHD was the one that was put on Ritalin when he was in school, because he was the youngest of the bunch. And he's the one that I would say probably, I would have a hard time diagnosing, or whatever the appropriate word is. But I'm guessing there's a lot of that out there. A lot of women who just, well, we're hitting a break here, who are just like overwhelmed and don't realize that this isn't how they think this is how it is, because this is essentially how they were born. Let's talk some more in just a moment about how to reach out to these people, what can we do for them, how can we change our schools. We've talked a little bit about medicine and therapy and things. We'll be right back with Dr. Ellen Littman. Stick around.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Dr. Ellen Littman is a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of New York, and we'll be back with more of her work and thoughts right after this. And welcome back. Dr. Ellen Littman is with us. Her website is drellenlittman.com.
Yep.
Yeah, drellenlittman.com. So to the issue that I just brought up.
It's a great point, because obviously when your mother was growing up, there was absolutely no thought of girls or women having ADHD. And the experience of women, especially women who are mothers, is a situation where they are overwhelmed all the time, and they feel frantic and different, and they have trouble doing what many call the job from hell, which is just to manage all of these different details and organize a whole bunch of people, especially people who may not be organized themselves, and they feel different than their peers. And women want to conform to the gender role expectations of our society, whether or not they actively intellectually agree with them or not. They still feel compelled to do so, and women with ADHD are always seeing themselves fall short and are filled with shame about it. And shame is the central experience. While they're struggling to do all these things, they tend to feel they're not entitled to ask for help, and they just struggle valiantly, but generally silently. And that's where the anxiety about trying to be hypervigilant and make sure they get all the things done that they need to get done for themselves and their families, and also demoralization when something falls through the cracks, as it just necessarily will.
Yeah.
And those are the things that start contributing to the negative outcomes that we are discovering.
Yeah, my mom would never invite neighbors over to the house because she was just embarrassed by what kind of housekeeper she was, and in fact, when Louise and I got married, this is 47 years ago, she would go over and help my mom clean the house and just do these like 2-day binges. But within a few weeks, it was just back to, kind of craziness. And so if you had my mom or somebody like her in your office and you were sitting talking with her as her therapist, what would you say?
Well, the thing that we can do as clinicians to be helpful, we can't change brain wiring, but we can do a lot in terms of reframing so that people can accept themselves and even celebrate their strengths and understand that everyone has strengths and weaknesses, and the fact that they may be disorganized homemakers, which, for many women, it's absolutely humiliating, even though it's irrelevant in the broader scheme of how who one is as a person and how their families turn out. So getting women to accept, to question societal ideals. So what is the feminine ideal, and does it really make any sense? And what part of it do you really need to adhere to? And what actually is a better fit for you? And the idea that it is okay to ask for help, and that's not a sign of weakness. So there are a lot of things that women can learn to come to terms with.
Great stuff. Great stuff. We'll be back with Dr. Ellen Lippman in just a moment. Stick around. Welcome back to the Thom Hartmann Program. Dr. Ellen Lippman is with us in the studio. Her website is Dr. Ellen Lippman, Dr. Ellen Lippman, LITTMAN.com, and a clinical psychologist licensed by the state of New York, et cetera, and co-author of Understanding Girls with ADHD, and in fact, one of the world's leading experts on women and girls and ADHD, and it's such a pleasure and an honor to have you with us, Ellen. We were talking about the woundings and the damage that goes along with this on the one hand, and I'd like you to address some of those negative outcomes, that are the consequence of that. But also this, this is now fairly well accepted to have a very, very large genetic component. My ADHD mom produced a bunch of ADHD boys, and which was problematic for all of us in some ways. But I didn't mind growing up in a messy house. I thought this, in fact, I thought it was kind of cool. But how does that happen? And also, why is that gene there? Is there some value to this?
Well, I think you certainly have made the best argument about the fact that there is a lot of value evolutionarily to hunters, that made sense, especially for men. And then women are just trying to start to embrace, well, what would it mean to be a female hunter, to be a warrior, to feel like they can go out and do the things that their brains are best wired for, that to follow their passions and to be visionaries. And that's really where, I think the work is in those who are really thinking progressively, is not to simply go with acceptance and not feeling shame about not having baked the cupcakes for your child's birthday yourself, but you bought them in the store, but really to say, okay, so what are you better wired for? And delegate and get help with the things that are rote, repetitive, and like that aren't going to move yourself, your family, or the world forward.
So my mom should have hired a housekeeper, for example, if she could have
if
afforded
it's possible.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something that plagues women, and they feel like they're not allowed to move on until they have made all the beds and cooked a 3-course dinner every night, and rather to say, okay, those are the things that are not necessarily important to being, a good human being, and what are the things that you are better wired for, and pursue those, and understand that there are strengths and weaknesses for everyone, and it is not weakness to not do those things, because men with ADHD do not seem to have that same concern. They have secretaries, they have wives, and they can move forward with their interests, and women also could use wives, essentially. But the idea that women are entitled to pursue the things that they want to do based on the way their brains are wired. Unfortunately, what most women with ADHD do at this point in time is continue to feel ashamed and worse about themselves. They keep this a secret. They don't tell their friends. Often they don't even tell their spouses, and they suffer silently. Right. They would never tell a doctor about it. They minimize, and
so they need to reach out and get help.
Yeah.
Dr. Ellen Lippman. Ellen, thanks so much for being with us today. It's great talking with you.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
If you want more information about this, Dr. Ellen Lippman's website is drellenlittman.com, drellenlittman.com. Today we're reading in Thom Hartmann University Book Club from How to Stop Worrying and Start Living, Time-Tested Methods for Conquering Worry by Dale Carnegie, perhaps an appropriate book in the era of Trump. This is from Chapter 2, a magic formula for solving worry situations. Would you like a quick, surefire recipe for handling worry situations? A technique you can start using right away before you go any further in reading this book? Then let me tell you about the method worked out by Willis H. Carrier, the brilliant engineer who launched the air conditioning industry and who headed the world-famous Carrier Corporation out of Syracuse, New York. It is one of the best techniques I've ever heard of for solving worry problems, and I got it from Mr. Carrier personally when we were having lunch together one day at the Engineers Club in New York. When I was a young man, Mr. Carrier said, I worked for the Buffalo Forge Company in Buffalo, New York. I was handed the assignment of installing a gas cleaning device in the plant of the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company at Crystal City, Missouri, a plant costing millions of dollars. The purpose of this installation was to remove the impurities from the gas so it could be burned without injuring the engines. This method of cleaning gas was new. It had been tried only once before and under different conditions. In my work at Crystal City, Missouri, unforeseen difficulties arose. It worked after a fashion, but not well enough to meet the guarantee we had made. I was stunned by my failure. It was almost as if someone had struck me a blow on the head. My stomach, my insides began to twist and turn. For a while, I was so worried I couldn't sleep. Finally, common sense reminded me that worry wasn't getting me anywhere. So I figured out a way to handle my problem without worrying. It worked superbly. I've been using the same anti-worry technique for more than 30 years. It is simple. Anyone can use it. It consists of 3 steps. Step 1. I analyzed the situation fearlessly and honestly and figured out what was the worst that could possibly happen as a result of this failure. No one was going to jail me or shoot me, that was certain. True, there was also a chance that I could lose my job, and there was also a chance that my employers would have to remove the machinery and lose the $20,000 we had invested. Step 2. After figuring out what was the worst that could possibly happen, I reconciled myself to accepting it, if necessary. I said to myself, this failure will be a blow to my record and it might possibly mean the loss of my job. But if it does, I can always get another position. Conditions could be much worse, and as far as my employers are concerned, well, they realize that we're experimenting with a new method of cleaning gas, and if this experience costs them $20,000, they can stand it. They can charge it up to research, for it is an experiment. After discovering the worst that could possibly happen and reconciling myself to accepting it, if necessary, an extremely important thing happened. I immediately relaxed and felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in days. Step 3. From that time on, I calmly devoted my time and energy to trying to improve upon the worst which I had already accepted mentally. I now tried to figure out ways and means by which I might reduce the loss of $20,000 that we faced. I made several steps and finally figured out that if we spent another $5,000 for additional equipment, our problem would be solved. We did this, and instead of the firm losing $20,000, we made $15,000. I probably would never have been able to do this if I had kept on worrying, because one of the worst features about worrying is that it destroys the mind's ability to concentrate. When we worry, our minds jump here and there and everywhere, and we lose all power of decision. However, when we force ourselves to face the worst and accept it mentally, we then eliminate all these vague imaginings and put ourselves in a position where we are able to concentrate on our problem in the here and now. This incident that I have related occurred many years ago. It worked so superbly that I've been using it ever since, and as a result, my life has been almost completely free from worry. End of quote. Now, why is Willis H. Carrier's magic formula so valuable and so practical, psychologically speaking? Because it yanks us down out of the great gray clouds in which we fumble around when we are blinded by worry. It plants our feet good and solid on the earth. We know where we stand, and if we can't have solid ground under us, how in creation can we ever hope to think anything through? Professor William James, the father of applied psychology, has been dead since 1910, but if he were alive today and could hear this formula for facing the worst, he would heartily approve. How do I know? Because he told his own students, quote, "Be willing to have it so. Be willing to have it so," he said, because acceptance of what has happened is the first step in overcoming the consequences of any misfortune, end quote. The same idea is expressed by Lin Yutang in his widely read book, The Importance of Living. True peace of mind, says this Chinese philosopher, comes from accepting the worst. Psychologically, I think it means the release of energy. That's it exactly. Psychologically, it means a new release of energy. When we have accepted the worst, we have nothing more to lose. And that automatically means we have everything to gain. After facing the worst, Willis H. Carrier reported, I immediately relaxed and felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in days. From that time on, I was able to think. Makes sense, doesn't it? Yet millions of people have wrecked their lives in angry turmoil because they refused to accept the worst, refused to improve upon it, refused to salvage what they could from the wreck. Instead of trying to reconstruct their fortunes, they engaged in a bitter and violent contest of experience and ended up victims of that brooding fixation known as melancholia. Would you like to see how someone else adopted Willis H. Carrier's magic formula and applied it to his own problem? Well, here's one example from a New York oil dealer who was a student in my classes. I was being blackmailed, the student began. I didn't believe it was possible. I didn't believe it could happen outside the movies, but I was actually being blackmailed. And, you know, he goes on with the story. It's a fascinating one. How to Stop Worrying and Start Living by Dale Carnegie.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Yes, ma'am. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, helping you win the water cooler wars. And Mick in Detroit, Michigan. Hey, Mick, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Going back to the issue of abortion, it seems that we are being forced by the federal government to subsidize abortions through Planned Parenthood.
No, we're not.
Yes, we are.
No, we're not.
Yes,
when a person goes to a Planned Parenthood clinic for a pap smear or a consultation about breast cancer or something like that, and they're on Medicaid, that reimbursement from the federal government, pays for that service, just as if they had gone to any other hospital or facility in the United States. If a person goes to Planned Parenthood and is referred out to an abortion provider or Planned Parenthood as the abortion provider, there is no possibility of any of those federal funds being used to pay for that procedure. It's illegal. Is it the Dickey Amendment? I think it is. Made it illegal. It's anyhow. There was an amendment to an appropriations bill years ago that simply made that illegal. And Mick just dropped off the line. Oh well. So to Amy in Rockford, Illinois. Hey, Amy, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. Thanks for taking my call. When you were talking with the doctor about women or females having ADHD.
Yeah, Dr. Ellen Lippman. Yes.
I came across this great description of myself who I think have ADHD, but I never finish anything. And the name that they call it is the hyper creative mind. And sounds like your mom, actually, because you have all the symptoms of ADHD. You daydream. The big one is not finishing anything.
Yeah, that was my mom.
Yeah. And you just have all these great ideas. You daydream and you just can't keep on task because you have all these great, fabulous ideas that are going to make $1 million, change the world. Why don't these people do it this way? So I guess that's the thing is the people are creative and get stuff done, but they just can't finish anything. Like your mother. I mean, my house is just a disaster. I have projects started all over. But then because I'm always thinking of new things, I leave it half done and go on to the next great idea.
Yeah.
So my family and friends are always like, well, why can't you get anything done and everything? And it's just, you can't stop your brain from thinking. So I just thought I would share that because I think that was pretty much describes myself, and I bet it describes a lot of people.
Yeah, I think so. Ellen is absolutely brilliant and so insightful, and her message is so important. My mom, you even look at the characteristics of risk-taking associated with ADHD. When my mom was 19 years old and going to Michigan State University during World War II, the way that she paid her way through college, it paid her tuition, which was only like $40 a semester, but still, the way that she paid her tuition and her room and board for at least 2 years was at the Lansing, Michigan airport. She got a job propping planes. This was back in the days when you had to have a person in front of the airplane who would pull a propeller because they didn't have electric starters for the planes. And you had to jump out of the way once it fired off or it would slice you in half. And people routinely died propping planes. And that's how she put herself through college, was propping planes at the airport. And in exchange for some of that, she cut a deal with one of the guys who owned one of the airplanes to teach her how to fly, and she got her pilot's license. And this is a 19-year-old girl. She's almost the profile of a boy in a way, but once she got married and settled down, then she became Ellen's classic person. And I, of course, didn't know her before she got married and settled down because I wasn't born yet. But it's just, you hear these stories. And Amy, apparently you've got a pretty good chunk of self-insight. And I'm guessing that's a really healthy thing for you. I hope it works out.
I just try to make it work to my advantage. I get something like that I don't want to do done, and then I reward myself with, listening to music or writing or doing other things. Right. So it's like that's the way I've figured out.
Yeah, there you go. So, we all come up with our strategies. Amy, thank you for the call. It's great to hear from you. Daryl in Atlanta, Georgia. Hey, Daryl, thanks for listening to SiriusXM. What's on your mind?
Hey, Tom, how are you? Good to talk to you, long-time listener.
Thank you.
Listened to you before you were great, before you were the Muhammad Ali of talk radio.
Thank you.
The greatest. But anyhow, Tom, I have an idea. I wanted to talk to you guys about, creating this blue wave that we need to have. Mm-hmm. And working with Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms and being on some of the committees with some of the guys, the most effective thing that we did was
Is that the mayor of Atlanta? Pardon?
Yes, that's the mayor of Atlanta.
Okay.
And she won by 500 votes. But what we did, about 15 of us went hand-to-hand. We called it hand-to-hand combat, just going to different strip malls, hair salons, barbershops, just approaching people and saying, hey, you registered to vote. Let's get you registered. What I want to appeal to is some of my white brothers and sisters out there listening to the Thom Hartmann show to make contact with 3 eligible voters that are probably not registered. And, 3 African-American people that you run into every day. It could be that security guard at the parking lot, or it could be one of the girls in the cafeteria where you eat at your job or your college, or it could be the African-American young guy or girl 5 cubicles down from you. Just go up and say, hey, do you you know that the upcoming midterm election is probably the most important election of our lifetime? Are you registered to vote? You're not? Oh, let me show you. myvoterpage.com, Georgia.com, Texas, or New Jersey, wherever you live. Mm-hmm. It'll give them all the information, where to go to vote, the address, who the contestants are, what the issues are, things like that. And if we could get, let's say you've got 4 million people out there listening out right now. If you get half of them to get 3 African-American voters to register, to get them interested, because most of them, and I've found that by going out and doing hand-to-hand combat myself, is that a lot of them are watching in, reality shows and sports, and they're not politically involved. There's one story that I always tell. I call it the Thom Hartmann story. I say, did you know that African-American soldiers coming back from World War II didn't have the right to vote or couldn't get a GI Bill to go to college or to start a small business? It's because people weren't voting. It's because people didn't get out there. And I use the example of Alabama, where young African-American women got out there and registered, and they voted, and they made the difference in the election. Yep. And that's what we need to do. It's going to be work. You don't have to climb the Statue of Liberty, although I admire the young lady that had the gumption to get out and do that. Yeah. Climb the Statue of Liberty, get her point across. We just have to talk to each other.
No, I get your point, Daryl, and I think it's brilliant. And I just went to myvoterpage.com, and it is not loading. I don't know if we just crashed the site, or are you sure that that's the name of the URL?
I think that is. It was my voter page. That's the one that my voter page Georgia, my voter page Oregon. Yeah. And
okay, I just tried.
It may have crashed.
Yeah, I think that may be the case. But I'll check it out. Daryl, thank you. It's an impassioned and articulate and very, very well said. Thank you so much. I appreciate the call. It's great to hear from you. Anita in San Antonio. Hey, Anita, what's up?
Yeah, African American women had a hard time voting in Alabama in the 1950s.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. The amendment you're talking about, by the way, hi, Tom. Sorry.
Hi, Anita.
Hi. The amendment you were talking about, that was the Hyde Amendment that banned
Hyde Amendment, thank
federal
you.
funds. Yes.
You're right.
Yeah. And by the way, why are federal funds banned from subsidizing abortions? Some people consider it is a legal procedure.
That's right. It's not just a legal procedure. It's usually not. I don't know if it's usually or not, but it's very often a medically necessary legal procedure.
Right. Well, it just I don't understand these. We pay for things that we don't believe in our taxes
like
all
war.
The time. Maybe exactly, or weapons and all kinds of things we don't agree with. Yeah. But that's part of being an adult citizen in this country. You end up having to pay for things that maybe you don't always agree with. And if they don't agree with abortion, I'm sorry, but it is illegal. The Supreme Court ruled it legal. So it just drives me crazy that they throw up this, we're subsidizing, which isn't true. Yeah. But we should, by the way.
So kind of
poor women.
Get over it. Yeah, I'm with you. I totally agree. Anita, thank you very much. Very well said. Shek in Riverside, California. Hey, Shek, what's up? Shek? Oh, Shek. Sometimes people try to turn on their phone or take it off mute, and it just, I'm sorry, that wasn't.
Hello,
that wasn't Shek. Now I have Shek. Hey, Shek in Riverside, you're on the air.
Oh, hey, Tom, how you doing?
Good. I think I pushed the wrong button before. What's up?
Okay, so recently I've been reading up, and I watched a few videos on this program that they have in China. And I know China's no arbiter for human rights, and we shouldn't model ourselves after China. But they have a program in China called Targeted Poverty Alleviation, where the government, the local governments, go to people who live in poverty, and as opposed to just throwing them money or making them beg for it, they ask them why they're in poverty, why they can't find work, and whether it may be, oh, I need child care for my children, I take care of my family, I need job training, and they give them these things as opposed to just throwing money at them, and it actually helps them lift people out of poverty. And I think, do you think that could happen in America anytime soon, or what could be holding that idea back?
Yeah, what would hold it back is this libertarian concept that if you're poor, it's your own fault. If you're poor, it's because you made poor choices. If you're poor, it's you're less than a full human being and probably shouldn't even have the right to vote. That is the core belief of the libertarians and the Republicans and the so-called conservatives these days, and that's the big challenge. When I was in Cuba, they have banned homelessness in Cuba. And what that means is that if there's still a few homeless people, they tend to be people who are high-functioning schizophrenics. I met one of them. He had perfect teeth, by the way, because they have free medical services in Cuba, which includes dental care. But he was, kind of a street beggar, but about the only one I saw. And the reason why is because, if you're on the street, they give you an apartment. If you're hungry, they give you food. I mean, medical care is free throughout the country. What is preventing any of that here in the United States is this bizarre right-wing ideology that has held and consumed the Republican Party for so many years. Jim, thanks for the call. It's nice to hear from you. Steve in McLean, Virginia. Hey, Steve, what's on your mind?
Hey, first of all, I'm a newbie. I just found out about your program like a couple of months ago, and I am learning a lot from it. I really appreciate it. Secondly, what I called about was in response to the person who had, I guess it was in Arizona, saw the bumper sticker about...
the only good liberal is a dead liberal, yeah.
Yeah, I am seeing this online. I go to, actually it's Yahoo, and I saw someone with an account name that said, I think it said, genocide all libs.
Yeah, I've seen death calls for liberals. I get them in email, sometimes directed at me. And we just turn them over to the FBI when that kind of thing happens.
Yeah, and the thing about it is how to approach that, or things like that. I did not report the person. Maybe I should have reported them. And basically, how to have some kind of presence, some kind of voice to turn things positively back. That's all I got to say.
Well, I think that's going to happen in the ballot box, Steve, and also when you see these things online. I mean, sometimes responding to them just elevates them because now you've brought them into your social circle. Yeah. But certainly putting positive messages out. We are progressives. We want to strengthen Social Security. We value families. We value health care for all, things like that. That can be done.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Thanks so much for the call, Steve. Great to hear from you. We'll be back with more of your calls in just a moment. And welcome back. Oh, let's see here. Omar in Herndon, Virginia. Hey, Omar, what's on your mind today? Thanks for watching us on our app.
Yes, sir. Tom, thank you so much for taking my call. That was very powerful, I think, what the doctor said, because when we talk about mental health, we always talk about men's. We never talk about women's. And we have a lot of times, there was a lady in Houston that drowned her kids. All those things are things that affect women's, and that was really important thing. And the other thing I wanted to say, I think your family is a perfect example of American family. Your mom worked as an airplane, and all these different things that happen really are important things to demonstrate how every American family should be like your family. And the last thing I wanted to say, how every campaign, most of the time people have a slogan like Trump, Make America Great. Mm-hmm. I think the next president, Democratic side, his campaign slogan should be return to decency. That's it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's what America wants. And, the slogan now that the Democratic Party has officially adopted is the better way or a better plan or something like that. And I think, or a better deal. And I think it should be the real deal, frankly. And I've been lobbying members of the Progressive Caucus on that. I think they agree with me, or at least they're patting me on the head and telling me they agree with me. But the Democrats need to have something that's aggressive and that ideally, has a verb in it. But that's, we'll see where we go with that.
I mean, just return to decency. In addition to that, pointing out all Trump lies and all his hypocrisy, you do that, whether you're a midterm election or a presidential election, just hammer him with that during the debate. Return to decency, and that will be it. Thank you so much.
There you go. Thanks a lot for the call. Diane in Alabama watching us on Free Speech TV. What's on your mind, Diane? You wanted to talk about abortion?
Yes, the lady calling about abortion.
Mm-hmm.
People may think that it's legal and it may be in the sight of man, but God is the one that they're going to have to stand before because it is murder. I understand that sometimes there is a case where the baby may not, the mother may need to have an abortion because of her life. And that way I would say it would be the only way to go. But these people that think that it's legal, that's just to satisfy their mind. They need to think about judgment is coming. And they're going to have to stand before their God.
Diane, I understand your perspective, and I understand your passion and your concern, but do you think that man should be making these rules? I mean, if you think that people are going to be judged by God, should we insert ourselves into that process by making abortion completely illegal? Is that what you're suggesting?
God made the rule from the start. There's never been a question about abortion. It should have never been allowed unless it was the life of the mother.
Well, God committed several abortions. There are a number of places in the Bible where God caused women to miscarry. There's, in I believe it's Leviticus, if you punch a woman who's pregnant and she miscarries, you have to pay a certain amount of shekels. There's abortion is in the Bible. And was practiced by including the Catholic Church for at least 1,000 years. But anyhow, Diane, I thank you for your call. Thanks. You present your position well. I don't agree with it, but you present it well. We'll be back. And it was a very articulate, response. We'll be back. It's 8 minutes before the hour.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Thom Hartmann Program is also brought to you by Cameron Hughes Wines. Cameron Hughes scours the world looking for the finest wines. You can get more information about Cameron Hughes and his wines at chwine.com/Thom, Thom. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by XChair, the XChair office chair. XChairTom.com is the website, XChairTHOM.com. Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. More information is available over at tomsbeets.com, THOMSBEETS.com, or by calling 800-568-9889. With you and Jim in Cleveland, Ohio. Hey, Jim, what's on your mind?
Yeah, hi, Tom. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I'll be brief. I just think that the Democrats need to get and coalesce around a solid platform of Social Security, Medicare, everything the New Deal that made the society more profitable and brought people out of poverty, and show them not only did it work and does it work, that it can even work better. And we're all behind each other, and let the representatives go to their own districts and tout that, knowing that there's images of they're all together on this. They're standing on the Capitol stairs. They're wrapping themselves in the flag, and they're all yelling. They're all together on how they can not only profit the middle class, the working class, and the poor, but also it's beneficial to the wealthy too, because it creates a stronger society, a stronger marketplace, a more profitable marketplace. There's no shining city on a hill if there isn't a good foundation underneath that city.
Yeah.
And that's what the safety net does for us in this country.
Jim, what you're describing actually is the Democratic Party platform. It's the platform that Hillary Clinton ran on. It's the platform that was written before the last presidential election and continues to be in effect. The Democrats, the challenge is messaging, and it's not that there aren't good Democrats providing a good message and trying to get it into the media. It's that the media will basically not book Democrats onto the, particularly onto the bigger shows, unless they want to talk about Donald Trump. And
well, let's take it right on onto the Capitol steps, and maybe we'll get some coverage that way, and say, you know, vote blue. Republicans have nothing for you. And one more thought: if Donald Trump wants that wall, he can go to the rich donors that he gave a big tax cut to, and go ask them for the money and see what they tell you.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, well said.
Run them out on a rail.
Yeah, Jim, thanks a lot for the call. Ken, watching us on Facebook Live over in Phoenix, Arizona. Ken, what's on your mind?
Hi, the news about Ed Schultz prompted me to make this call. And, you know, I listened to Ed for a long time, and I disagreed with him in many cases, but he actually, I think it was TPP, he went against what most progressives were saying. And at one point, he actually turned around and said, you know, I was wrong on that.
Yeah,
and
I know.
not only that, here's why I was wrong. And the point I want to make is, you know, Bernie has been on your show several times, and 3 times specifically that I can remember. One of your callers would ask him a question, and he would say, you know, I don't know the answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that compare to many Republicans who always have to snap answer? One of your previous callers mentioned a bumper sticker. And if you have a bumper sticker mentality, I would suggest that maybe you're incapable of a deep thought.
Yeah, critical thinking is something that we have lost badly. Ken, excellent points all. Thanks. James in Glendale, Texas. Hey, James. Thanks for watching Free Speech TV. What's real quick, please? We're hitting the break right now. We're in the break. In fact, we're bailing out of the show. James, you're going to have to call back tomorrow. I'm sorry. We're out of time here. Thanks so much for being with us today. And don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires you. Get out there, get active, tag. You're it. There is so much that needs to be done. This is such a vitally important election. You know, please, the caller earlier has suggested get 3 people registered to vote, African American or anybody else, particularly, you know, young people, working class people. Get your friends registered. We'll see you tomorrow.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair office chair. xchairthom.com is the website, xchairthom.com.
Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally. For more information, call 800-223-8242
or visit tomsbeets.com.